Hello everyone, welcome back to another stream. Hope you're doing well as always. So yesterday on our stream, we watched a couple videos, just reviews of Lies P, one by Mortismal Gaming, another by Ratatosker, and then the last one was by Maximilian Dude. And I'm kind of vindicated to know that other people were having similar issues, it seemed, to the issues that I was having, although they didn't go into super great details about the parries the same way that I was having problems. But yeah, it could just be a skill issue with me. So anyway, with all of those videos queued up yesterday, one that I did want to get to but did not was Pinocchio is a story about art and God, because that was quite often recommended to me throughout my playthrough of Lies of P. So I figured we can start off today with catching up with that video. Pinocchio is a story about art and God by Jacob Geller. And then from there, I was wondering what would be a good transition style video to go from Lies of P to Elden Ring. And Noctigals from Valkyries to Giants, Elden Ring's Mythological Web seemed like it could be a good match for that, because if they're talking about the mythology behind Pinocchio and whatnot, or the lore behind Pinocchio, then I figured perhaps something more about the real life lore behind Elden Ring could be a good follow-up video. So then after that, depending on how much time we have left in the stream, I have two videos queued up by Elden Tales with The Wisdom of the Stone and The Great Ripple. So that's kind of what I've got queued up for today. Thought this was a bit longer. Anyway, maybe I might need to add another video later, but we'll see. So anyway, Galeezy, I'm in. Welcome back to the stream. Hope you guys are doing well. Lore Hunter is good on Lies of P? Okay. So yeah, I don't know how much this video here talks about Lies of P specifically versus the Pinocchio ethos. Although, to be fair, I guess I see Carlo in the thumbnail, so he might go into a bit. Hey, Jesse R., welcome back to stream. Hype, nice. And thank you all for joining me tonight of all nights if you are a football fan. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive on into our first video with Pinocchio is a story about art and God by Jacob Geller.
This video will discuss major plot points of Pinocchio, Lies of P, and AI artificial intelligence. It, like all my videos, is better on Nebula. In the year 2022, 3 different Pinocchio movies were released, 2 of which were made by Academy Award-winning filmmakers.
I had no idea that there was even one Pinocchio movie, let alone 3 that got released in 2022. All right, yeah, I might need to look into this stuff, I guess.
Pinocchio movies were released, 2 of which were made by Academy Award-winning filmmakers, and I thought to myself, that's fine. In the year 2023, one of the best games of the year was a spin on the popular Souls-like genre, except instead of medieval knights or Lovecraftian beasts, the game based its lore on Pinocchio. And I thought, seems normal to me. But for some reason, learning that legendary directors Francis Ford Coppola, Federico Fellini, and Stanley Kubrick all had dreams of making a Pinocchio film and were only stopped by death or massive lawsuits has pushed me over the edge. Like, there isn't some other Pinocchio, right? I haven't missed something. We're talking about the puppet, the fairy tale?
Yeah, this is kind of wild for me to learn this as well. And yeah, now I'm definitely a lot more intrigued than I feel like I otherwise would have been. iMan says there's one more, if you're correct. Pinocchio 3000 or something. Yeah, that's kind of wild because I don't know, I kind of lost my train of thought. Oh well.
In the past 80 years, there have been at least 15 explicit film adaptations of Pinocchio, even more TV specials and guest appearances, countless books for both children and adults, and an ever-growing list of projects that may not have Pinocchio in the title, but are in one way or another twists on the same story of a little wooden boy. What is it about a puppet without strings that requires so many different artistic interpretations? It's not like Coppola, Del Toro, Fellini, Zemeckis, Spielberg, Calvino, Kubrick were all dying to untangle the mystery of Goldilocks. I want to understand this. I need an answer, and over the past several months...
Yeah, that's a really good question, and my preliminary answer would be that I think the story of Pinocchio can reach many other people in a way that other fairy tales don't, because it's fundamentally a story about somebody who is inadequate for their role, yet through their actions and their deeds, they kind of rise to the occasion to become the thing that they are not, which is just very aspirational on many levels there. So with Pinocchio being a puppet, he wants to be a real boy, and then to go along with that quest, we deal with a lot of other, quintessential fairy tale tropes, like with the whole aspect of lying. But not only is lying just a fairy tale-esque type thing, the fact that there's a kind of physical consequence of that, I think, is very... I don't want to say like poignant, but it's like striking in a way that many other tales are not. Which isn't to say like other tales aren't striking, but there isn't always that clear sense of consequence for one's actions until it's kind of too late. Whereas Pinocchio's lies are done incrementally and add up over time, I think, which might make the story feel a bit more realistic, that it's not typically like one crisis event which causes things to come tumbling down from people. It's a series of smaller actions which like leads them, to that crisis point to begin with. That's kind of like where my headspace is on that right now. Oh yeah, and then Scott Lisi says, Pinocchio adaptations hit on the theme of man versus creator, but the original book's kind of just a wacky chapter by chapter children's story. And that's another good thing to bring up as well, the whole role of Pinocchio trying to find his place in the world, which is kind of ironic because he's a tool. And because like puppets are tools, they kind of intrinsically have purpose. But because he wants to be a real boy, he's kind of like breaking the original purpose behind his creation and wanting to be something more, which might have a lot of parallels to the idea of if God is the supreme divine maker and the reason things get made is because they're tools and have a purpose, then what is the tool, or like what is the purpose of man, is kind of one question that naturally rises up out of that. So I know there's like a better way to phrase that. I'm pretty sure it's like a fairly common like thought experiment, or that's not like the right word, but thought in general. And yeah. Hello, hey you, welcome back to stream. Pinocchio refuses to take some medicine, so a bunch of rabbits carrying a coffin stroll in to scare him. Black Rabbit Brotherhood? Okay. Yeah, so I really just do not know a lot about the real life story of Pinocchio whatsoever, and apparently not nearly as much about the adaptations as well.
I've consumed so much Pinocchio-based art, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Because here's the twist. There's not a simple reason all these artists are obsessed with Pinocchio, because Pinocchio isn't about anything. It's about everything. You wish upon a star. The Adventures of Pinocchio.
Hey, you asks, have I ever heard of Black Souls 1 and 2? I don't think I have, no.
Original work by Italian author Carlo Collodi was a serialized story that released a chapter at a time in the Giornale per i Bambini, or newspaper for children. Between 1881 and 1882, readers were treated to the trials and tribulations of Pinocchio, an absolute dipshit of a wooden puppet. Reading through Pinocchio often feels like an oops all goofus edition of highlights. The story broadly operates as a sort of morality tale, and Pinocchio is virtually always on the wrong side. Geppetto, who himself is described as a bad-tempered man, carves the puppet out of wood, and the first thing the puppet does is steal Geppetto's wig, kick him in the nose, and run out into the street. The townsfolk then decide that Geppetto is abusing Pinocchio and drag the woodcarver off to prison. If you're familiar with the nonchalant brutality of other fairy tales, parts of Cinderella read like a Coen Brothers movie, the random cruelty of Pinocchio may not come as a surprise. But what's still jarring about the original story is that now iconic parts of Pinocchio lore appear only briefly, if at all. A talking cricket shows up in chapter 4 and tells the puppet that good boys are obedient and that he should learn a trade to earn an honest living. Pinocchio.
Yeah, this is like one of the most like quintessential Disney did you know this kind of factoids about Pinocchio? And I feel like this is probably one of the only bits of Pinocchio lore that I actually know off the top of my head, that he smashes Jiminy Cricket with a hammer because he doesn't want to be a good boy. Oh, it's a slice of life manga. Okay. Hey, Without Horns, welcome back in. And then I-Man was saying Pinocchio is an anti-narcissistic story. Maybe that's why its importance kind of came on top. People lie, but the reason why is important. Yeah, and I think that's kind of something that is very difficult to grapple with when you're a young child, because the world is often depicted to children as being black and white, and the idea of lies in general are just kind of carte blanche taken as bad things. But there can be very valid reasons to lie, and we may as well turn to the most quintessential philosophical argument, in which all philosophical arguments devolve down to, with the whole scenario of the murderer at the door. So if you have somebody in your house and somebody else knocks on your door and asks if that person is there, and you know the person at the door is there to murder them, what do? Do you tell them the truth that the person is there, or do you lie? And it's like a lot of people try to like wiggle their way around it and say like, oh no, I wouldn't let them in, I would refuse to answer, all this stuff. I mean, that's kind of irrelevant. It's just another way, I think, of bringing up the equation of the binding of Isaac in a kind of more modern, easier to understand principle. And I didn't necessarily want my stream to go like super down the rabbit hole of like hard religion and like philosophical questions, but sometimes they come up, and I feel like if you treat them in an academic fashion and are respectful, I don't mind doing it here and there, but it can get, pretty dicey depending on everyone's individual viewpoints here. So take the following that I say with like a grain of salt, and you can keep your own morality and work with the constructs that you've been given throughout your life. But from my understanding of Christianity, lies, like pretty much all lies are bad, and there's like no exceptions. So even white lies are bad. So if you had a murderer come to your door and ask for somebody within your home, if they were there, you should tell that person honestly that that person is there, yet still have enough faith in God that what you are doing is the right thing, and that God will take care of you for doing the right thing. Kind of similarly to how Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac for the Lord. Was it Abraham? I kind of like drew a blank on the name. So anyway, he went to the point of literally getting ready to murder his child out of devotion for his God when the final message came down to like, oh, stop. Like it was all a test. You have like the proper amount of faith, you pass, essentially. That is kind of like same scenario that's supposed to happen here. But anyway, that is something that you still can teach to children, but quite often the real world operates on different principles than ideals and idealism. And so a story like Pinocchio bringing up the concept of white lies still being lies is kind of something that might challenge a lot of young children's preconceived notions about the world. So maybe that is part of the so-called magic behind the story there. And yeah, as Cantrell did right here, that's kind of like one of the wiggle rooms. Like that's kind of ignoring the question. It's a principle about truth and lies. So you tell them to go away, you're not really answering the question. So, yeah. See, it's not murder because God told him to. And that's like it's a whole other can of worms. And that's why I'm like trying to impress upon the principle that absolute goodness is supposed to come from God within that framework, and any kind of deviation from that is kind of acting against God and putting it puts strain or damage on that person's relationship with God and whatnot. So I know many people will feel many different kind of ways about that, but that's just kind of been my understanding, looking into like that story specifically and like going down that whole moral ethical rabbit hole. So sorry to get a little bit heavy there for a moment, but let's go back to some more lighthearted puppetry. Yes, Kencho, there is a rule where you have to answer them, and that's kind of like trying to address the question head on, because if you refuse to answer, somebody could argue that's a form of deceit. I don't necessarily feel it's that way. And I mean, realistically speaking here, this is just supposed to be a mental exercise. It's not supposed to be something that's like taken so literally. So certainly you don't have to answer the person. You can also say, yes, they're here, but I'm not going to let you in. There's all this kind of other stuff. And because of like these kind of weird stipulations, the question often gets manipulated into being, okay, well, like what if you're harboring a Jew and a Nazi comes to your door? Like it's essentially the same scenario, just with different flavors. And there is probably not going to be a universally good, realistic, and easily understandable scenario where it could make sense where somebody is forced to tell the truth or a lie. I mean, that's just kind of not how the real world works there, which is kind of why I'm trying to talk about the framing of the question as being a bit insufficient, and why people often try to like wiggle around it by avoiding answering the question directly there. You paused the video. I was like, oh no, my audio went out. All right. Hey, Clown Scum. Welcome back to the chat.
Enraged, says that all he wants to do is eat, drink, play, and wander around, and then kills the cricket with a hammer. His nose only grows twice in the whole story, and entire chapters seem to completely disregard the fact that Pinocchio is a puppet at all. This is maybe because, in the most notable difference to its adaptations, Pinocchio's desire to be a real boy only shows up in the 25th of 36 chapters. It feels like serialized fiction often does, that the author neglected to start writing with a conclusion in mind, and instead has to scramble to wrap everything up. But in Collodi's case, this is only partially true. The story was actually supposed to conclude 10 chapters earlier, when Pinocchio was, I am not kidding, killed by assassins. The intended ending of the adventures of Pinocchio was in chapter 15, when a cat and wolf chase him down, throw a noose around his neck, and hang him from a tree until he dies. Which, in a morbid sense, is kind of the most ironic death a puppet could have. Only after a public outcry and Collodi's editor reminding...
Oh, because he's literally dangling from a string, if you think about it that way. Yeah. I like that he didn't spell it out.
Him how successful the serial was, did Pinocchio recover from his fatal hanging, meet a blue fairy, and go on several more adventures. He traveled to what would later be called Pleasure Island, got swallowed by a big fish, and eventually became a real boy. Much of the appeal of reading the 1880s story...
Yeah, and Pinocchio getting eaten by a gigantic fish kind of always gave me Jonah and the Whale vibes, although I'm not like super familiar with that story, and it's been an extremely long time since I watched Pinocchio, so I don't know how much water that holds, pun intended, because, yeah, now I'm kind of curious about like the Disney version of Pinocchio and the other ones, so hopefully this video scratches the itch, otherwise I might just do a little bit of digging myself.
Story today is how uncompromisingly mean it can be. Lampwick, Pinocchio's truant friend turned donkey, eventually dies in front of him. The cat and fox, once assassins, fall into such deep poverty that the cat goes blind and the fox sells his tail. Pinocchio proudly tells them, "If you are poor, you deserve it." The moral, and the political slant of the book, is abundantly clear. Working is good, begging is bad. Obedience is the one path to becoming a real boy, a functioning member of society, and ultimately, how you earn your father's love. But there's a stickiness to the story itself that makes it memorable past its moralizing. Its darkness is compelling. Pinocchio's constant failings make him more relatable than all.
Oh, Scalise said you believed it was a shark in the original story, which is why the submarine in Lies of P looks like a shark. You know, I didn't even think about the whole fish-shark parallel when we got into the submarine. Probably because, like, little more than a cutscene in the game, but that's kind of a cool nod to the original story that the devs left in the game there. Hey Stella, welcome back in. Collodi and Doyle shaking hands over being forced to resurrect the character they killed off. I mean, money.
All the adults demanding his attention. And ultimately, The Adventures of Pinocchio subverts the typical fairy tale archetypes simply through its unpretentious choice of subject. My favorite line in the whole book is probably the opener. Once upon a time there was a king, my little readers all shout. No, children, you are mistaken. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. In its unpretentiousness, The Adventures of Pinocchio doesn't really comment on a mountain of topics implied by the themes of its story. Art, agency, family, God. These things would come to define Pinocchio, but only through 150 years of using Collodi's text as a foundation. The 1940 Disney adaptation, maybe the biggest event in the history of Pinocchio as a cultural idea, grabs onto the most obvious topic that Collodi glances over, that Pinocchio himself is an inanimate object brought to life, a block of wood turned into a boy by the craft of an artist. Actually, this is specifically not true in the case of the book. The block of wood is already talking before Geppetto carves it. But even then...
Oh, that's really wild.
The fact that Geppetto can make a boy out of this talking stump, one that can run and dance and misbehave, is basically taken for granted in the original story. Not so in the 1940 film. Returning to it for the script, I was struck by how little it takes any of its liveliness for granted. Only the second full-length animated Disney movie, Pinocchio finds constant delight in things we might take for granted. There are long stretches early on when nothing happens except a cat opens a window or Jiminy Cricket watches cuckoo clocks, sections with essentially no story significance or character growth. These parts of the movie instead exist purely to enjoy the animation itself, the overly laborious route the cat takes to the window, the over-engineering of a dozen different cuckoo clocks. I am not...
So... because I'm assuming this is not from the point of view of Pinocchio, he might have a point here. But one thing that I kind of took for granted in my daily life for a long time is just like, how ordinary things were to me in my surroundings, my setting and whatnot. But once I got, the newest dog, the puppy, and got him home and just noticed how he was looking around the rooms at things which were mundane to me. So he would be examining all of the things on a bookshelf, which it's completely uninteresting to me. I walked by it hundreds of times and never gave it a second thought. But because the puppy was actively looking and kind of absorbing everything in the room, that just kind of made me reappreciate how much I kind of took for granted a little bit in a weird way. And I feel like maybe that's kind of what is being impressed upon us through this kind of form of animation, in that looking at the world is kind of something only children do to a certain extent. And I know that phrasing right there is very problematic. It's I'm not trying to say everyone's blind, but I do think there is a kind of quintessential difference in how people interact with new situations. And when you're a child, with everything being pretty new to you, it just kind of takes a different lens to look at the world through the eyes of a child, I suppose. So that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from this. But I could be wrong because, I'm only seeing a snippet of a couple clips at a time. So it could have just been an animation thing for all we know. The biggest Pinocchio event is not a sentence you thought you'd hear. Wood had been taken from a magic tree, and Antonio was a drunk man who ovened that wood. Oh man, it's wild. Hey, Elden enthusiast, welcome back to the stream. How you doing?
Not a classic Disney guy at all, but there is genuine magic in these moments. The movie not asking us to attach our emotions to a specific character, but instead the technical feat of thousands of hand-drawn images coming together into something greater. And so, even though the movie never draws an explicit parallel between its medium and subject, Pinocchio the boy serves as a metaphor for Pinocchio the film, something delightfully willed into life by a combination of artistic skill and magic. Both seem in love with their newfound ability to replicate what it is to be alive. To accompany this new enthusiasm for life, many of the book's harder edges are sanded off. Geppetto is made much more gentle in the narrative of the Disney movie and expresses his own hope that Pinocchio might become a real boy. The cricket isn't crushed under a hammer and instead serves as the puppet's protector and conscience. Pinocchio himself, although he still skips school,
How wild would it have been if in the second Disney film they just straight up smashed Jiminy Cricket? That would have definitely altered the trajectory of history, I feel. You're doing your best to stay hard at work, otherwise you're doing okay? Yeah, I feel that. I've been working on a script as well. It just takes a lot of time and, research, effort, and rewrites. So best of luck with all that, man.
Joins a circus and takes a trip to Pleasure Island is depicted as charmingly naive, rather than the little stinker he is in the book. Disney's Pinocchio mostly does away with the moral that you should grow up and get a job, but that doesn't mean it doesn't moralize. Instead, as Georgia Pantelli writes in her thesis on Pinocchio, I'm not the only one with this obsession, Disney presented a world where the only safety was within the family. Collodi's...
I absolutely appreciate the references here, which is, very nice to do, very academic, which I think we could use more of in YouTube, to be honest. You're just like video essays. And that's kind of something that I've thought about for like a long time. I know now in academia, there's like, maybe that was not the right word to use there, but in academia, there's a lot of focus on creative writing as it pertains to things like prose and fiction. But I don't think there's enough focus placed on creative writing as it relates to things like video essays or communications. Obviously there's like TCOM or telecommunications and stuff and like advertising, but I feel like there's such an untapped market to teach people how to kind of format essays in a style that's like non-academic in nature. So what I mean by that is if you go to like a university, college, whatever you want to call it, and you take, the basic English courses and whatnot, they'll give you the super basic rubrics of how to write a standard essay, but they want it to be very sanitized and academic in nature and kind of lifeless, I feel, for quite a lot of things. Whereas the approach to a video essay and like the YouTube thing does away with a lot of those kind of silly conventions and wants to have the narrator, I guess, or author be much more personable to the audience, which is not focused on hardly at all in academics. So if I were in charge of a English department somewhere, I would like really want to focus on this aspect of what I would call like literature or whatnot. Anyway, that's just kind of a bit of an irrelevant tangent that I went on there. So hey Joji, welcome back to stream. Clowns Scum and their friends would have beat Jiminy Cricket with a mallet. Tell you what? Okay. Oh, I-Man got wrecked by the ads. My condolences, dude. I can't really control them. Elden learned some more stuff that'll help you explain the law of causality and regression, stuff like that. Yeah, good luck with that. I have some ideas, and I'll probably talk a bit about them in my next video as well, hopefully. So you better get yours out before I get mine out. Good luck.
Pinocchio was street smart and learned how to become responsible by his exposure to the road. He encountered thugs, but also helpers. In Disney, all external encounters are dangers, and the message is that the only safe place for the child is the family. As will become increasingly clear, one of the Pinocchio story's strengths is its near-infinite malleability. In Collodi's hands, its protagonist has to learn to stop goofing off and become respectable in order to raise his family out of poverty.
So on that notion of like family being the only safety, I think part of that is because it was a product of its time, and way back when communities were much smaller, and it was harder to rely on strangers for support to a certain extent, and family was quite often the most assured way that somebody could land on their feet if they were like traveling to a new area or a new location. And um I would say like family bonds were much stronger back in the past before like the advent of technology, just because those are the people that you'd spend the most time with, and those bonds were something that was really emphasized by society, and there was also a lot more incentive to have bigger families to like cover up like a lot of the work and things like that. And so for reference, my grandmother on my mother's side was one of 10 children, or was she the one of 11? And my grandfather on my mother's side was one of 11 children, or vice versa. I can't remember which is which. You know, that's only one half of my family there. And so I've heard stories of like my grandpa or grandma needing to like go to a certain area in like a different state, but not really like having anybody over there. But because the family was so freaking large, they just happened to have another like family member connection, which they could like talk to and coordinate with and get some information, like have a bed to sleep on overnight while they needed to do their thing or whatnot. And that was a much bigger part of their daily life than I think it is now, where things are a hell of a lot more convenient because you don't necessarily need to rely on a family member to get, you know, bed and breakfast. We have Airbnb now. We have all of these kind of entities to make these issues non-issues. But navigating the world way back then was much more difficult, and family was one of the easiest ways to circumvent a lot of those difficulties as they would arise. But of course, that isn't to say like everybody had family everywhere. I'm just saying like the family unit was much stronger in the past, I think, or like these examples at least. And the Disney film kind of reflecting those principles doesn't really surprise me, even though they might come off as a bit draconian now. I think having that context is really important to keep in mind. Italians with their huge families, Roman Catholic. Doesn't necessarily need to be Italian specifically, but that'll do it. Yeah, man says teaching people to form arguments that are simple and easy to understand is so hard. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's kind of like one of the reasons why I feel like it takes me so long to produce a lot of content. And I still don't feel as though like I'm the best at it or anything but like that. It's just unironically a little bit of the Dunning-Kruger effect, because I know what I know, but it's very hard to relate what I know to other people without coming across as condescending by over-explaining things or losing people along the way by under-explaining things. And then because I'm like so deep in the rabbit hole sometimes, it's really easy for me to lose sight of what somebody should or should not know, and like not everybody's on the same page or talking about lore to begin with, so it's just difficult. But you know, it's a kind of enjoyable process nonetheless. It's kind of like putting the pieces of a puzzle together as coherently as you can. Scally's grandfather grew up on a dairy farm. Right now, that town has a population of 59 people. The first time he ever saw a black person was when he was 14. 14 isn't really that old, to be honest, for like some people to not have encountered a black person in their lives. Which I mean, I'm not saying like that's like young either, but I mean, I don't know. It's just kind of wild how different circumstances were in the past versus now, and how much similar the world has gotten through technology and things like that. Because I mean, look at the stream alone. I mean, I'm certainly talking to some of you guys who are all over the world from the comfort of my own home, and yeah, that's just kind of absolutely wild, isn't it? Oh, Iman is saying in the north you don't have big families. Okay. M said MD Amin, welcome into the stream. Same thing. Your grandpa has a crap ton of brothers and sisters. Yeah, it's kind of a norm back in the day, and now like with people becoming more educated, the birth rate has declined quite significantly there.
Disney, 50 years later, frames Pinocchio as a wonderfully goofy boy who just needs to remember that all the love he needs lives at home. And for someone like me, who loves these sort of comparisons, what's extra fascinating about all this is that 80 years later, the same company, Disney, gave another Pinocchio the full feature treatment. With a budget of $150 million and Oscar-winning director Robert Zemeckis at the helm, Disney's 2022 Pinocchio is another chance to see how flexible the Pinocchio story is, how it can...
I'm not so sure, like, blowing this up is really that relevant because Disney has been kind of doing a renaissance of their old films and adapting them into like live action versions anyway, or CGI ones. So I guess it isn't too wild that Pinocchio would have gotten one as well. I don't do a good job keeping track with this stuff. So I know they came out with like Beauty and the Beast. The Lion King got an update too. And I always felt like some of these, I was just like, why are these getting like remakes? You know, like the originals still feel every bit as relevant. So it's just kind of odd to me. But anyway, not too important. Hey, Doctor, and welcome back in. And later, Elden, if you're dipping out for the night. Dr. Ann's mom's family is made of 10 siblings. Your father's is 11. Meanwhile, it's just your sister and you. Yeah, that isn't too uncommon. Well, maybe that like bit of a difference was like my mother was one of 6. I would need to like count, but I don't want to take the time to do that. So definitely a big family for now's standards, but still significantly fewer children than in my grandmother and grandfather's family. You know, the new Disney is horrendous. The Disney didn't do well on the Pinocchio anyway. The best Pinocchio remake is Liza P. Got him. Oh yeah, Maleficent. Wait, that isn't a remake, is it? But yeah, that was actually pretty decent, I think. They also did Alice in Wonderland, although I guess that's more Tim Burton than Disney, and that was way earlier than like the other Renaissance stuff. Disney doesn't do story anymore, they do spectacle. Yeah. Okay.
Be resculpted to fit into the culture of our modern day. And perhaps it shouldn't be surprising then that this is one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life.
Lol.
My name is Pinocchio.
Maybe this one's on me for expecting better. Zemeckis, who directed in the first 30 years of his career some of the most technically...
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily blame him because Robert Zemeckis made Back to the Future, if I remember correctly. So, I mean, that's just one of my favorite trilogies of all time. So I would have definitely hoped Pinocchio wasn't disappointing at the very least, let alone one of the worst films you've watched in your entire life.
Accomplished and narratively satisfying pieces of American cinema. Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, cast...
Oh god, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is just so ridiculously good. And now that I see it pop up, it just kind of makes me lament the current situation of the whole Acme versus Wile E. Coyote movie. Or maybe that's the other way around, Wile E. Coyote versus Acme. Anyway, I am a little bit suspicious as to whether or not this is all just like a marketing ploy to get people support the movie in their contrarian style nature, but who knows, maybe I'm wrong and the movie will get like shelved and or deleted. It's just kind of baffling, but nonetheless, I was really hoping that that movie could meet the standards kind of set by Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And yeah, anyway, kind of getting off topic there.
Castaway Contact, Forrest Gump, has in the 21st century become fully consumed with the potential of motion capture movies animated entirely digitally. The Polar Express, A Christmas Carol, Beowulf. Remember Beowulf? A couple years ago, Patrick Willems made an excellent video.
No, I literally don't think I heard of that version of Beowulf. I only ever read like the original, not like the original like super old English version, but a translation of the original. Jessica Rabbit was too fine. Once Upon a Time got carried by Robert Carlyle. Oh, no need to apologize, man. The Wishbone version of Beowulf. All right, now I know that Scowleezy is a real one. Who told her that? And then Scowleezy said, a lot of the new Disney stuff feels like take your grandkids to see at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday material, which is kind of their target audience, I guess. Yeah, I feel like they're really just banking on brand recognition and adults wanting to share an experience with their children, even if they're just kind of mid, it's just kind of like algebra bait. I mean, it's working. They're making hand over fist in terms of, their money and whatnot.
Remember Beowulf? A couple years ago, Patrick Willems made an excellent video entitled The Sad Story of Robert Zemeckis and His Wonderful Toys that tracks his filmography as it descends into an obsession with these strange, waxy digital worlds. As his technical ambition has shifted into CGI land, his ability to tell a compelling story has suffered. However, there's a way where Pinocchio is a near-perfect story for him to tackle. Zemeckis has spent decades chasing the dream of creating false humans who are indistinguishable from real ones. Now enter Pinocchio, a story of a created boy who wants nothing more than to be real. In 1940, Disney thrills audiences and itself with the magic of illustrations charmed into movement. Now, in 2022, Zemeckis can do the same with a computer-created heightened reality, the tech and the narrative working towards the same goal.
So I don't know if that was intended to be shade, but oh my god, if that was shade, that was so good. This is like the whole line about like making fake humans. I know a lot of people really enjoy the Polar Express movie, but that is just something that I can never get into because it feels way too uncanny valley for me, and it's just kind of hideous to me personally. Sorry if you're watching Mortis. It was definitely shade? Yeah, that's the vibe that I'm getting, but it wasn't necessarily if you just take it at face value.
This isn't what happens, of course. Pinocchio, much like the other Disney live-action remakes, can't find a single artistic reason to exist. There are vanishingly few meaningful differences from the original Disney film. Pinocchio goes through exactly the same series of events, in the same order. The characters have been slightly tweaked. Pinocchio is more hapless, Jiminy is more annoying, the cat is this horrible CGI creation. There's a scene where Pinocchio stares in wonder at literal horse. But most disappointing of all is how visually dull the whole thing is. For instance, that cuckoo clock bit still happens, and now all the cuckoo clocks are references to other Disney and Zemeckis movies, but no one is having any fun with it.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought he was like saying dull as in a more literal sense, whereas like the film does kind of look desaturated, and I kind of noticed how dark it was with like Geppetto looking at Pinocchio earlier, so I kind of wondered if you meant it that way, but apparently not. And also, I did adjust my sound, so let me know if that's a bit better for you guys.
Is it cool that a fake Toy Story character can pop out of a 3D modeled clock? Or does the movie include these references because it has no faith in its own ability to be inherently aesthetically compelling, the way the original film was? In a staggering regression, 2022's Pinocchio fails to ever communicate what the 1940s version did so effortlessly, that art coming to life is amazing in itself. Despite the film's false wonders and complicated liquid simulations and accurately modeled bounce lighting, maybe because of them, Pinocchio the puppet and the film feel purposeless, incredible technical achievements without an ounce of magic. Even the film's one narrative swing, a slightly ambiguous ending where we don't actually see him grow into a real boy, is completely undercut by the grotesque new Jiminy explaining away that same ambiguity.
It seems like Robert Zemeckis really does like that uncanny valley of his CGI. Like, this is just wild. This looks like something a child would carve in, like, just trying to finish like one of those goofy ass dioramas that they need to complete for their elementary school class that they do at like 4 o'clock the day before it's actually due. So anyway, hey, howdy, welcome back in the stream. How did I like Lies of P? I enjoyed it quite a bit. I had some like issues with the combat here and there, but it was better than I expected it would be. It was a very strong foray into like the Souls-like genre, and I think it's will help elevate the competition into higher heights as we move into the future, I hope. How can you not smash that, Jiminy? Hey, Clown Scum, smash or pass?
Pinocchio is as real as any real boy could ever be.
But in the demonstration of the flexibility of this story, even this failure can be worked into some understanding of Pinocchio's themes. Zemeckis entirely unwittingly performs a sort of Pinocchiotic inversion. His film is so obsessed with the aesthetics of reality that it's robbed of any sense of magic. Unlike Pinocchio himself, the film fails to ever become more than the sum of its parts. Maybe it's this final challenge, the magic, the spark, that's attracted so many artists to it. Maybe the story consumed Coppola, Fellini, and Kubrick because it represented the great goal of filmmaking, to take text and celluloid and endow it with life, sculpt it into something that grows beyond their raw technical skill. Or maybe there's still more to the little wooden boy. In a journal article titled, prepare yourself, Pinocchio and Pinocchiology, author Jennifer Stone writes that particularly in Italian culture, Pinocchio is a stable for innumerable critics, writers, and psychoanalysts, all who try to carve a niche in the vast literature of Pinocchiology. They write about its religious themes, she says, its ideas of nationalism, its linguistic structure, and yet, she says, one idea has been ignored by even the so-called psychoanalytic critics. Why aren't we talking about the fact that his nose is clearly a Let us now proceed, she writes, to read about the vicissitudes of Pinocchio's adventurous libido in contest with his mortified ego. Stone's spiral into Freudian analysis of Pinocchio is somewhat matched by Robert Coover's novel Pinocchio in Venice, in which the now adult puppet his nose becoming a to better with, and everyone in Venice, including like because everyone talks in Pinocchio and everyone. There is, as with everything, a world of Pinocchio-based adult entertainment if you are unfortunate enough to type in that combination of words. Elsewhere, the puppet becomes a symbol of social decline. In the fittingly titled book, The Will to Be Human, Italian psychiatrist Silvano Arietti first diagnoses Pinocchio's antisocial behavior on the lack of a mother figure in his life, and then writes an entire chapter on Pinocchian alienated and newly committed youth. Arietti designates unnaturally alienated young people as members of the Pinocchian subculture, youth who unleash the id, abandon the road to maturity, disregard education, and take easy trips to artificial toy counters, which ultimately lead to dehumanization. Arietti
That's kind of really interesting to me because it sounds like the Italian take on hikikomori, which are essentially shut-ins, like the Japanese version of a shut-in or like a hermit, people that become like antisocial and don't venture outside and kind of escape into virtual worlds or books and things like that, rather than interfacing with real society. And they're quite often portrayed as being childish and refusing to grow up. So you could say like they're not like the real boys, I guess, essentially. But anyway, who said it? Oh, yeah, Scalise said, you totally forgot the current fan theory is that the nameless puppet is made from Carlo's original body. I will not lie and say that I did kind of wonder that as well when it like kind of focused on the nameless puppet's like shoulders and back. It looked more skin-like than that of the other puppets, which kind of seemed a bit more porcelain, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it. And so that thought did cross my mind, but then I'm not entirely so sure how well it works once it gets decapitated. But yeah, it does have a certain amount of appeal, I admit. Nameless is definitely Carlo. Okay. Oh no, so that wasn't Champion Victor's last name. He was just called Hercules on like a couple of the flyers before the grand exhibition. So yeah. Iman says Nameless is not body, it's machine. It could have been a little bit of both, a little bit of body and machine, like cyborg type thing. Ara says 80% of the people on the Elden Ring subreddit. Oh no, it's probably because you're replying to Scowly. It's not confirmed, but it fits so well, everyone keeps it as canon. Then Ara said, so 80% of people on the Elden Ring subreddit, yeah.
Diagnosis is based on what he identifies as the Pinocchian philosophy of be, do not become, a sort of hedonistic short-term pleasure-seeking that results in a neglected future. This is, to me, a frankly bizarre reading of Pinocchio because the story's back half is entirely about becoming something, growing into a real boy. Yes, Collodi's Pinocchio is, what did I call him? A dipshit? But his depiction of the puppet is compelling because of how often he surfaces the struggle between Pinocchio's short and long-term desires. Towards the end of the novel, Lampwick convinces Pinocchio to run away to Pleasure Island, but only after pages of Pinocchio agonizing between what he wants and what he knows he should do. Arrietty ultimately declares that the Pinocchian philosophy, these youths who refuse to mature, stems from the fact that the world is too easy now and their parents don't discipline them enough. He was talking about people born in the 50s. It's a bland reading of history, and an inaccurate one of Pinocchio. What Arrietty correctly identifies in the Pinocchio story, however, is the unavoidable theme of parentage. It's possible to read Collodi's original story as one of adoption. Before Pinocchio is carved into a human figure, he's a mischievous talking stump, and perhaps this pre-existing personality is why he's so resistant to guidance. But in most adaptations of Pinocchio, Geppetto creates Pinocchio entirely, placing him as close as possible to his biological parent. Read from a parent's perspective, Pinocchio is an anxiety-laden tale about how no matter how hard you try to impart common sense onto your child, they will go out into the world and make mistakes and act foolishly and be taken advantage of.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking earlier today just how wild it was, the hijinks I got into as a child within the intervals that I was not being like actively supervised. And believe it or not, I was quite a rapscallion as a youth, but it feels like a lot of the world has changed and a lot of the parenting styles have changed to be a lot more helicoptery than even when I was a kid, because I was a latchkey kid. And so I guess for anybody who doesn't know what a latchkey child is, it's a kind of phrase that came up in the 90s to describe the type of children whose parents were at work and the keys to their homes would be like left, nearby, so that way they could like break into their own houses and be left unsupervised while their parents were at work. And so they were just kind of unsupervised children without babysitters who would just go home and chill while no one else was around after school. So yeah, what else is I gonna say with that? Oh yeah, and just like the parenting styles today, it doesn't seem like children are afforded nearly as many, I don't necessarily want to say like freedoms, but opportunities to be alone and kind of make those types of mistakes, which are like kind of character building. But I mean, I feel to a certain extent that's just like waxing nostalgic on people's own childhoods, because like childhood is always a personal thing, and most people generally appreciate their childhoods, or at least parts of their childhoods, and there's always going to be like life-shaping events, no matter how sheltered or not the child is. And of course, like, these are all like generalities, and there's always been children who've been too sheltered and kind of rebel against their parents, and I'm sure like that's going to continue to be a thing. And I'm certain that there's still going to be children who are have to be more independent and don't have as overbearing or protective parents as well. Yeah, there was somebody called Descartes and Liza P. Chadwick says the more things change, the more they stay the same. A little bit. But I do honestly feel, even though you're joking here, that like the advent of technology, especially recently, has absolutely changed the landscape and the architecture of our minds. And I feel like the kids growing up today are in for a rough time because of that. So I feel pretty thankful that I grew up in a time where I was able to grow up with technology, but even I was pretty spoiled in terms of my access to technology. Not like that I had like unfettered access, but like it was the Wild West, So I was lucky to kind of grow up with it and understand the good and the bad. But anyway, yeah. Cantrell said, you thought kids got in trouble? They got into the trouble they did know because they were left alone mostly? I think so, to an extent, but trouble isn't always bad, believe it or not. And I think a certain amount of trouble and mischief is probably good and conducive to somebody's overall growth. Because there's so many stories of kids who've been overly sheltered as children, and then once they get their first taste of freedom as an adult, they go crazy and they can't handle it, and they'll just party all the time and burn themselves out, or OD and like really mess up their lives if they can even continue to have life after that. But yeah, that's just kind of maybe going too far down that route. Joji says most kids don't know their parents because they don't know how to socialize. Oh yeah, and that's going to be another like really big difference. Like, as I was mentioning earlier with family and whatnot, and those ties being much stronger in the past, I would say part of the reason they're weaker today is because there's less need to socialize face to face because of the way that technology works. Like, back when I was a kid, cell phones weren't really a thing, or at least they weren't as ubiquitous as they are now. And texting wasn't really a thing until I got older, and like the plans were different and people like, anyway. But nowadays, like, kids are growing up and they're sharing like group chats with each other when they're still in elementary school, or they're creating like Discord servers and like literally harassing each other while they're not even in school anymore. And it is just such a different landscape from the one that I grew up in. And I, was still pretty well inundated with technology when I was growing up, which is why I say like the children today have way more issues as far as like technology is concerned. And then when you add in the lack of social skills because they don't need as many face-to-face relationships, I think that really compounds the problem even further. Back in my day, phones had actual keyboards. Yes, yeah.
While Arietti claims that Pinocchian youth will never mature, it's easy to read the book as giving parents the exact opposite message. One must spend several years with a little wooden head before eventually being gifted a brain. But Pinocchio is first and foremost a book for children, and since they're far more likely to identify with the puppet than Geppetto, it's not a story about parenting. It's a story about God.
Oh, here we
Because, yes, Geppetto is Pinocchio's father, but far more in the Our Father who art in heaven way than, like, the my old man way. And once you start thinking about this, you really... AI, Artificial Intelligence, is a 2001 film, directed by Steven Spielberg, but largely...
It's kind of funny because, although AI is what I was thinking about, how I flippantly referred to many of the puppets in Lies of P as iRobots, because they looked like the iRobot model. Anyway.
produced by Stanley Kubrick, who worked with several screenwriters on the project before dying in 1999. AI is a Pinocchio movie about the cruelty of being created by a god who abandons you. Loosely based on Brian Aldiss's short story Super Toys Last All Summer Long, AI begins as a sort of sci-fi horror story for parents. Henry and Monica Swinton are a wealthy couple in the 22nd century whose human son is sick and being held in a vegetative state. Because his recovery seems impossible, Henry brings home a robot. Although other bots in the world of AI appear fully human and have sophisticated programming, this one, named David, is different, because this one will...
This movie seems oddly familiar to me, almost like a fever dream. So I wonder, like, if I saw this as a kid and just maybe only like had a one-time view. Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah, the pre-Black Mirror. I was about to make that comment earlier, like the Black Mirror before Black Mirror. Stella says, the social media version of the internet kind of sucks. It's become a panopticon of socially conditioned surveillance driven by corporate interests. That's probably said a little bit too well there, Stella. But yeah. Yeah, okay. I had to like struggle for a second. Like, is that an M or is it Arnon? You know, because sometimes the R and N character could look like an M. So anyway, Amun feels the same way about that movie. Interesting. It's an incredibly weird movie. Hey, Spoon, welcome into stream. You feel like you saw the movie, but you don't know when. You remember the boy's face melting at some point? And I was kind of wondering whether or not this dude kind of just gave me James McAvoy vibes, and I might be like misremembering and thinking of like James McAvoy's performance in Split. Because there's something about like the tilting and the intensity of the eyes and just like the actual like facial structure, which kind of makes me wonder how much I actually remember versus like, you know, letting things bleed over into each other. Donnie Darko. That's a fun one, yeah. Yeah, I did mention Donnie Darko a couple times in the playthrough. Maybe only once. You began to hate the youth when they said Master Chief was from Fortnite. That's great, Jude Law. See, I'm really bad with actors' names, but I'm really good with faces. So I recognize the name, but I cannot put like names to faces super well. I mean, I can over time. It's just like in through one ear and out the other. Like that's like the biggest weakness in my memory, because otherwise like my memory is actually very good for most things, but I just cannot really hold on to names super well.
Sophisticated programming. This one, named David, is different, because this one will be...
And just to defend myself, I know the little boy is Haley Joel Osment.
This one,
I do know some names.
David is different, because this one will be capable of genuine love. The scientist who created David believes that love is the key missing component of robot cognition, that love will allow a created machine to cross the gulf that separates programming and humanity. And after Monica activates David's love, he does come to life, in a way. He starts acting with a very human sense of irrationality. He's jealous, unpredictable, neurotic, and his irrationality makes him dangerous in a way that's amplified when their previously vegetative son recovers and returns home. Monica and Henry decide that they have to decommission David, returning him to the factory to be destroyed since his activated sense of love can never be reprogrammed. Or that's what's supposed to happen. But Monica can't do it. She loves David, at least enough that she can't bring herself to kill him, and so she does something far crueler. Abandons him in a forest and runs away. The movie...
Yeah, that seems very familiar to me. Like, there's, like, other parts of the footage, I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what the hell this is at all. And then, like, stuff like that, he's like, oh, I remember that. It makes me wonder, like, if I was, like, falling asleep during parts of this movie or something. Anyway...
The movie is no longer about the fear of having a child you cannot understand. It is now about the desperation of being rejected by the only thing that gives your life meaning. The remaining plot of the film twists familiar aspects of the Pinocchio story. David goes to a circus, he goes to Pleasure Island, he's swallowed by a fish. But Pinocchio isn't just alluded to in AI, it's an explicit driver of the story. David becomes obsessed with finding the blue fairy, the magical figure in Collodi's book that grants life to the puppet. He clings to the idea that if she could
And now I'm like, I have no idea what this movie is again.
make him into a real boy, he'd finally be able to earn his mother's love. It's an idea that destroys him.
My brain is falling out.
David is not born. He is made in his creator's own image, but he is meant to replace that which is
And now I'm back on board.
Both his gods, the father who made him and the mother whom he loves, give him the impossible task of filling the void left by their one begotten son. It is his failure to achieve this impossible task, his father tells him, that brings him closest to humanity. But the cruelty of David's mother, the cruelty of the Cybertronics corporation that machined his parts, was letting him live in the world at all. David asks the Blue Fairy to make him real, asks her for thousands of years to change him into a real boy, but AI suggests that love isn't enough to become real, nor magic. Instead, what makes David relatable is that he has the inextricably human experience of outliving, of being abandoned by God. I can't stop thinking about Pinocchio.
Yeah, that's some pretty heavy stuff. And on some lighter stuff, Howdy asked how stressed was I on Simon. Not that stressed. I killed him the second time around. Obviously, I was a little stressed towards the end there and gave it through a few consumables, but that's because I was not about to do that all over again. So that's probably one of the easier fights for me. Why does this look better than the live action Pinocchio? That's a good question. Well, he said Spielberg directed it, so I mean, it's Spielberg, the maestro, you know? How would I feel if you told me he was nerfed? I wouldn't mind. I heard his he used to be way spongier, tankier, which makes sense. I thought he was kind of easy, so maybe a little bit disappointed that he was nerfed, and that I would have preferred the more difficult version because I didn't have that much challenge. But I don't know, that's just kind of one of the weirder things of gaming nowadays is back in my day, games stayed the same when you bought them and took them home and played them for a couple years. Now they change every other week, you know? Did I like Lies OST? You thought it was really good. I honestly have no recollection of it. Part of that is because I'm streaming and I also just don't really get a strong impression of Souls-like games soundtrack as I play through them for whatever reason. A lot of this stuff tends to be more ambient and it just doesn't leave as much of an impression on me as compared to an RPG's music. Phase 2 is tankier, sorely unneeded, but the consumables are absurd in any version of the game. Okay. Oh yeah, so there were some pretty good tracks. I did appreciate some of the French stuff. Now that I think back on the game, I did some of the diegetic songs used going through different sections of Krat when you got to the Rosa Isabelle Street. I liked some of the stuff that was going on there. But I think the only song that really stood out to me was the weird kind of film noir-esque record that played in The Red Lobster. Alrighty, going back to the video now.
The legendary writer Italo Calvino once said that it is natural for us to believe that Pinocchio has always existed. We cannot imagine a world without Pinocchio. Is he right? Is Pinocchio core to our understanding of ourselves? Is the Bible just a big Pinocchio story? A fact about the film AI that's
Oh, and this song playing in the background, that was a pretty decent one.
Now permanently stuck in my head is that part of the reason Kubrick spent so long in pre-production is he didn't think the technology existed to convincingly make the story. More specifically, he didn't want a child to play a robot. He wanted a robot to play a child. He wanted an actual mechanical David to be the main character.
There was the face melting off.
Spielberg, when he took over, opted for Haley Joel Osment, which was probably a good call. But 20 years after the film's release, 50 after Kubrick started toying with it, a completely different team presented us with a completely different kind of mechanical child. Lies of P is a video game developed by NeoWiz Games and Round 8 Studio. It owes quite a lot to From Software titles, Bloodborne, Dark Souls, Sekiro, but its dedication isn't to From Software. It's to Carlo Collodi. In the world of Lies of P, set loosely in a steampunky version of the Belle Epoque of France, Pinocchio's literal lack of strings don't make him unique. He is but one of thousands of puppets, in this case automatons, all able to move and work and kill autonomously. Instead, Pinocchio is special because he can choose. He can decide whether he wants to tell the truth or lie, or rather, we can. Because this version of the puppet is controlled by us. The core conceit of Pinocchio gets a little strange when he's positioned as the protagonist of a video game. The character is meant to be unconstrained, either by strings or the rules of polite society. It is Pinocchio's agency that separates him from every other puppet, but ironically, in Lies of P, he is hyper-responsive to our every whim. No puppeteer has ever had a subject as well controlled as P, who can run, jump, swing, and slash and dodge at the speed of thought.
Apparently my mans has never watched G Gundam. That is a shame.
We often talk about video games in first person. I attacked, I defended. But the literal experience of playing a game is typically much closer to that of controlling a marionette, making the figure on screen perform recognizable actions through abstracted hand movements. Perhaps because of this, the Pinocchio of Lies of P is also a narratively less dynamic character than in other adaptations. There is virtually none of his trademark disobedience, his struggle between ego and id. Just as he controls perfectly, Pinocchio acts perfectly, totally compliant to his father, the Blue Fairy, and most other kindly adults in his life. He is neither relatable nor frustrating. Once again, his artificially high responsiveness, his total predictability, clash with his supposed agency as an elevated puppet. There is an explanation for this in the game's lore, and boy does the game have a lot of lore. Pinocchio's character is benched in favor of long histories of ergo, a sometimes crystallized life force, a petrification disease that stems from this life force, an automaton uprising, a cult of alchemists, monstrous archbishops, Bane? But Lies of P's ambition to explain its world comes at the cost of its legibility as a narrative. Even after spending a huge amount of time with the game, I struggle to concisely sum up what it's about. That's not to say it's a storytelling failure. The game's aesthetic is remarkable. Shuttery household robots repurposed for violence, a city caught between technological eras, humans racked with disease morphed into less recognizable shapes than the puppets that replaced them.
So yeah, trying to say what Lies of P is about is difficult for me, not necessarily because I can't think of what it's about, but just because it's kind of difficult to articulate and do it justice. And it might take a little bit more rumination on my part to get to a kind of satisfying answer. But until I get to that point, I can at least flounder and hopefully get something sufficient. And so I think there are a lot of themes present within Lies of P, which do have a lot of parallels to the other things which Mr. Geller has brought up so far in relation to humanity, mortality, and God, which are definitely worth considering further. And in many ways, we might be able to compare like the struggle that Simon Manus went through to the struggles Lucifer faced when confronted with those that were lesser than him, being given more prominence before the face of God and whatnot, you know, depending on like your accepted fan canon theory of what Lucifer was. I'm just kind of right now speaking more of like Milton Paradise Lost variant, but I mean that isn't exactly canon lore of the Bible, if you know what I mean. But anyway, humans kind of struggle to live their lives and do what they need to do. Other humans will exploit that. The unambitious won't really thwart their plans, and so they can just kind of use them as pawns or guinea pigs in their grand plans. And I feel like that's just a bit of a commentary on the nature of what I would call like the cannibalistic or darker side of humans. We're willing to sacrifice others for our own personal gain, and I feel like that has a lot of parallels to the dark and Dark Souls and whatnot like that, which is kind of comes part and parcel with comparing one Souls-like to another. But anyway, setting that aside, I do think the aspect of having the Immortals in Lies of P is very fascinating, and I do wish they went into a little bit more detail about that. Although, to be fair, I have not actually looked at every item description by any means, so they could be kind of hidden in plain sight for all that I know. I would need to do more sleuthing, but it's just kind of only alluded to briefly in a standard first playthrough of the game, which isn't necessarily good or necessarily bad. So I'll just kind of leave that there for now. And Carlo's role is odd, I will agree, because it's not clear if our goal is ever to really become a real boy, or if it's just to kind of be an obedient thing, or if it's supposed to be neither and to forge our own path with our own decisions and our own lives and our own brand of humanity. So I can kind of understand where Jacob Geller is getting hung up on this, but for me personally, I feel like looking at the alchemist's side of things and comparing their station with the so-called god to that of the actual puppets is interesting enough that I think it's worth further examination. So while I don't have a very good one sentence direct answer for the kind of question he posed, I think there is still something there. And I like Scally's demo theory that at one point P could have rebelled against our control and gained fourth wall awareness as the puppet. That would have been really cool, now that you mention it. The question is, who is Carlo? Carlo is not Pinocchio, or is he? Yeah. Our goal in Lies of P is only that of vengeance and to honor our father. No, you. Cloud Scum sees it as kind of gaining freedom and moving away from just being Carlo too. And so I think maybe one of the most fascinating aspects of Lies of P, which is I've not explored fully enough, is that of Sophia and her kind of final request. That is, there's a lot to unpack with that, and I don't want to step on a landmine because I'm not familiar enough with the text there. Okay.
One of my favorite designs in the game is this so-called Puppet of the Future, an enormous wandering crane that's effortlessly outclassed by the more nimble Pinocchio. In Krat, the city where the game takes place, we see a civilization that plunged into new technology without properly reckoning with its implications. Technology without morality, innovation without ethics. Lies of P echoes the cruelty of AI, the reckless disregard with which humans might create something only to ignore its suffering. If the game does have a central thesis, other than being a puppet lets you use really cool weapons, it's in the conflict between artificial preservation and organic loss. Geppetto's human son dies before the game begins, and all...
Yeah, that's a really excellent way of saying that, artificial preservation versus organic loss. And I was thinking about bringing up the whole issue with Antonia and the Red Fox and Black Cat with their reliance on the gold coin fruit to kind of potentially sustain themselves longer. But I think even that is kind of predicated on that whole idea of cannibalism that I mentioned earlier, with the fruit of the gold coin tree coming from what was formerly a listener and whatnot. And so going back to the cannibalism idea even more somehow, I think that whole aspect of ergo coming from humans adds another element to the story, because puppets aren't really puppets as much as they are ghosts that are kind of put into vessels in some ways. And of course, like, there's a little bit of a blurring of lines with the non-human, non-possessed puppets being like literal automatons and like being like functioning because of electricity or whatever the equivalent is in that world. But I think you guys get what I mean there. Chadwick says, isn't every Pinocchio story about letting go of the past and allowing the present to be valuable as it is? I don't know. That's a good question. You think about it from Big G's perspective, not Pinocchio, so maybe that's why you see it that way. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, if you're talking about like the moral that Geppetto should have learned, I can see where you're coming from with that. And I feel like, that's a very Dark Soulsian style conclusion to come to as well.
All the violence of the puppets is a result of this grief, in a roundabout way, if you read the lore. Simon Manus dreams of divine immortality and thus imprisons his daughter in a torturous, suspended animation. Pinocchio delivers
Oh, that's his daughter?
A robot baby to a woman, lies, and says it's her own infant. In your typical Pinocchio tale, this would read as darkly ironic. The puppet wants nothing more to be human, while
I don't remember if I lied about that part of the story.
Everyone around him abandons their own humanity. But in Lies of P, Pinocchio wants nothing, it seems. Nothing except to perform the whims of the player controlling him. He is never more real than what we allow him to be. Federico Fellini, for what it's worth, hated that Pinocchio had to become human at the end of the book. Although he dreamed of adapting Pinocchio to film, said the story read like a book of oracles, said all his doubts and problems found answers on the page, the end still disappointed. The end of the book is the poorest part, because Carlo Collodi, as a 19th century man, moralizes when the puppet becomes a boy. It is sad, because losing his marionettehood, Pinocchio loses his childhood, the marvelous life of knowing animals and magic, in return for becoming a good conforming idiot.
So it sounds like Federico Fellini wrote Catcher in the Rye? Got it.
It's a point he made several times in several different interviews. But of course it's true that we all lose the magical childhood, Pinocchio part of our being in touch with animals, with the night, with mystery, in contact with life, the way it should be. And with this loss, we become good idiots, good students, good husbands, good citizens. Maybe Fellini wishes he was part of Arrietty's Pinocchian subculture because he understands the inherent tragedy in maturing past the magic of the world. Maybe he sees the sadness in defining real by one's ability to obey and plan for the future. Maybe he also gets that it's just a strange way to tell a story, removing the thing that made your character special as some sort of final reward. As infinitely flexible as the Pinocchio story is, it's these ideas that tie it down. How can art enjoy being brought to life if it insists that it still doesn't live? How can the puppet not have strings if it inevitably needs to bend to societal pressure? And how can these themes be resolved while simultaneously grappling with every other aspect of the story? Parents, children, creation, God. Well, to start, you could put it in stop motion.
Oh no, that's kind of terrifying. Anyway, Dangerous Doug, welcome into the stream. He is suffocated beneath the expectations of a father whom he could never please on his own merits. And yeah, that's a pretty good way of saying it. And I think, like, in many ways, Geppetto doesn't even really care if Carlo or P becomes a real boy again. Hold on, let me rephrase that. I think he cares that he becomes a real boy, but I feel like he only cares about it as a kind of scientific accomplishment. I don't think he cares about the personhood of P, and he doesn't necessarily care if the puppet becomes a boy or like the thing within the puppet is even the puppet, if that makes sense. There is no personhood to P. he made a mistake by saying Simon was Valentinus, or that Sophia was. He made a mistake by saying Sophia was Simon's daughter when she was Valentinus's. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the you guys popping off in chat about that.
In retrospect, it seems blindingly obvious that stop motion should be the medium for Pinocchio. Forget drawings or CGI, why not actually sculpt the little wooden boy? And yet, with the exception of a largely forgotten and forgettable Rankin and Bass run in the 60s, cinematic depictions of Pinocchio have avoided making the puppet into a puppet. That is, until Guillermo del Toro and Mark Gustafson picked up that particular torch and took it to the stars. Pinocchio himself, in Del Toro's film, is about as visually flawed as he's ever been. He is deeply asymmetrical and unfinished. He only has a right ear, wood grain cracks and splinters across his torso, the back of his head is essentially an open stump. His feet, which he burns off almost immediately, are haphazardly reattached with bandages.
That's freaking awesome. Now I definitely want to watch this, especially if it's like by Guillermo del Toro. He's just like an auteur. Like he's a dude that like always has a vision and just kind of executes it, which I think is very respectable. And I know we have a lot of Kojima fans in the chat, or at least in the community. So if you guys like Cold Hotman or Hot Coldman or whatever the hell his name was, you should actually check out my man's real work. I don't even remember what character he played in Death Stranding. Anyway, low-key, that movie was incredible. Okay, cool. Why does the boy's nose get longer when he lies? What's the real reason behind that? It's the part of the video where it was supposed to be a phallic reference, but I think more realistically, the nose's consistent extension shows the consequences of one's actions and serves as a constant reminder that actions do have consequences. Del Toro is making a Frankenstein movie with lots of high-profile actors. I think I might have heard about that, but it just maybe I only saw like a headline. All right, Clown Scum, you're going to pop out for a bit because you never saw this movie and you're planning on it? Okay. Hopefully we'll see it again in a bit.
Carved drunkenly and sloppily, and he never becomes more polished than how his creator made him. But those imperfections don't stop at Pinocchio, they extend to the world itself, because stop motion is a medium in which the hand of the creator is always visible. Not just Pinocchio, but every character in the film, Geppetto, Cricket, Lampwick, God in Heaven, is unmistakably sculpted, poked, prodded, and machined by the continuous efforts of their animators. Stop motion is an unbelievably labor-intensive process, and one that's almost at conflict with itself. Its ultimate goal is to disappear, to tell a story with figures that appear to move of their own volition, and yet, it's so visually compelling exactly because you know they are not moving of their own volition, that every action is an expertly crafted illusion, working a frame at a time to create a world of puppets without strings. From a technical artistry perspective, I'm not sure any other adaptation has more cleverly used its medium to communicate the themes of the story.
I'm a little bit curious why they chose to go with the frame rate that they did, because this seems kind of extraordinarily low, even for stop animation. It almost seems like it's like 12 FPS, whereas the standard movie film is 24. So this seems like half the normal rate. And maybe it's just to like emphasize that fact. I'm really curious about that. Or, I mean, that's kind of like giving the benefit of the doubt. It's probably just a hell of a lot less effort to do stop motion with, literally half the frames. Let's be real there for a second. And Joji says his nose grows because there's no better way to commentate on an individual's inability to further than their nose. By lying, he thinks he gets further from what he is, but inevitably he'll always stay what and where he is. I think if you twist what you're saying there a different way, that you can kind of make a stronger point but with it by saying, like, if you can judge your distance from the world by the end of your nose, then by lying, you might think you're getting ahead, But if your nose grows because of a consequence of that lie, you're literally kind of ending up further away from the world, if you want to use that as your metaphor. So even though that isn't exactly what you said, I really do like that kind of imagery that comes along with that. Yeah, I know you have a character limit. You wonder if this movie's creation inspired Kojima to put in the puppet companion in DS2? When you say DS2, you gotta keep in mind that is not exactly the DS2 that I think of. I was like, what the hell? No. Oh no. Okay, anyway.
That the Del Toro movie is also a narrative masterpiece, it kind of makes me want to cry. My life has been Pinocchio for months. Most of the movies I've watched have been about Pinocchio. I've read books about Pinocchio, had papers translated because of Pinocchio. All I talk about to my friends and loved ones is Pinocchio, and here, Del Toro just gets it. Everything that is interesting about Pinocchio
Kind of reminds me of... never mind, it's not important.
is in the film. Every disappointment of Collodi's tale has been brilliantly tweaked, and the things it adds feel like fundamental pieces of Pinocchio that had simply been lost to time until now. To be transparent, I watched this movie pre-Pinocchio obsession and thought it was good. Really good, even. But it didn't click with me until I had fully immersed myself in this world, and you could maybe call that a fault of the movie, but I am just so relieved that someone really, really gets it. So let's go. The first thing to know about this adaptation is, while still in Italy, it's been moved up in time just a bit, from the late 19th to the early 20th century. The second thing to know about this adaptation is it's not going to be gentle. Geppetto and his human son Carlo live in a quiet mountain village. Geppetto works as a woodcarver there and is assembling his latest piece, a crucifix for the town's church, when a group of World War I planes fly overhead and drop a bomb through the roof. Geppetto's son is killed immediately, senselessly.
It was later said that Geppetto's little town was not even a target, that these planes were heading back to base and simply let go of their bombs to make their ballast lighter.
Geppetto plants a tree on his son's grave, and then years later, drunk, grieving, angry, he chops the tree down and hacks Pinocchio out of it, a misshapen puppet to replace his boy. The Blue Fairy shows up in trademark Del Toro style, looks absolutely bananas, and brings the wood to life. Geppetto is both horrified and frustrated. Pinocchio, loud, irreverent, and with a lot of the dipshit energy of the original book, is nothing like his son.
My name is Pinocchio. I'm your son.
You're not my son.
Geppetto, mean, restrictive, unwilling to acknowledge the many wonders of the world, also resembles his book counterpart. But unlike the book, Del Toro's film refuses to flatten this relationship. In Collodi's original story, there is little question what he thinks sons owe their fathers: deference, obedience, labor. But the film demands an answer to what fathers owe their sons. Is it guidance alone? Is it a father's job to puppeteer their son into maturity? Is it so impossible that they could learn from their children as well? And no matter how tightly each pulls the strings, does a child not deserve love? As Pinocchio dies, meets God, is resurrected, poses in front of the crucifix, the questions the story poses only grow.
He's made of wood too. Why do they like him and not me?
How much of our culture is based on a singular understanding of the relationship between parents and children? Do we allow agency, humanity, to the figures we immortalize in wood? Matt Zoller Seitz writes in his Criterion essay on the film that Pinocchio is not merely a movie about a puppet, it's a film about the idea of puppetry. It wants audiences to consider the possibility that whenever people open their mouths, other people's voices come out. Sons repeat the words of their fathers, patriarchs define the rules of reality. Christ does not speak in this movie, but the church does.
So that's a pretty powerful statement to mention that when people open their mouths, others' words or voices come out. And Kind of one of the first thoughts that came to my mind when hearing that just now was that of The Big Lebowski, where the more familiar you become with the film, the easier it is to catch up on these kind of mannerisms that the dude has. So one of his most iconic statements of like, "This will not stand, man," is taken from the dude seeing a clip of Ronald Reagan saying something like that on TV, and he just kind of passively absorbs it and then just transforms it into his own other thing. And so that's just kind of like one of the things that comes to my mind. And also, like, when we're children, I remember being extremely young and saying, "Oh, like, my mom told me this and this must be right because like my mom told me it was true," or whatnot. And that's just kind of something you take for granted until you find out, like, oh, maybe your parents don't know everything and things that they told you might not be so right. Which kind of reminds me of like this meme video where this dude pretended like his dad told him that when he was a kid that he needed to eat the crust on his bread because that's the healthy part. And so he just like went on parroting that for years until like he was like older, and then somebody's like, "What? That's not true." And so like this dude's world comes crashing down, and so like he Googles it, and then it says that the crust is the healthy part of the bread because it has like, 10 times more anti-cancerous agents or whatnot. And so he like feels vindicated that his pops didn't lie to him after all. So anyway, those are just kind of some of the random thoughts bouncing around in my brain right there. I just reminded you of a weirdly traumatic event in your childhood. I don't know to laugh or like to ask if you want to share or just how to react to that, because it's you delivered it so straightforwardly, or at least the text did, that I just don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Let's laugh at him. That's kind of messed up, Joji. We all have that. So, a Dangerous Doug had asked if the old man wanted to take his son as a doll. That's weird. I think yes and no. I think it was just a part of his grieving process, and being unable to let go of a situation that was beyond his control, which might like tie into the whole imagery of Pinocchio being a puppet, because we should always have control over puppets, but then Pinocchio is a puppet that is under no one's control and like no one's strings and whatnot, but who really knows? Hopefully Dr. N ends up fine after all, but let's go back to the video for now.
Through the mouth of a priest who labels Pinocchio an abomination. The priest declares that moral authority over the puppet belongs not to Geppetto, nor even God, but to another controlling father figure, the state. Because this Pinocchio is also about fascism. By excluding a few plot beats, you can make this adaptation sound pretty similar to the ones we're more familiar with. Pinocchio ignores school to join the circus and sing songs. He takes a trip far away with a bunch of rowdy boys. He gets swallowed by a big fish. But connecting each of these scenarios are threads that upend the original story's moralizing understanding of obedience.
Who controls you, wooden boy?
Who controls you?
For instance, Pinocchio joins the circus, but the show is co-opted into a nationalist anthem about the glory of fighting for World War II Italy. Pinocchio begrudgingly plays his part because he feels he has to earn money for Geppetto to pay off his debt. Only weeks old, and Pinocchio is puppeted, not by strings, but by economic pressure. This is mirrored by Spazzatura, the little abused monkey sidekick of the ringmaster, kept in line by violence and withheld love. But despite their strings, both Pinocchio and the monkey break the rules when their circus is visited by Mussolini. Yes, Mussolini. They put on a special show for the dictator, singing to him about how he eats boogers and shit. It's a juvenile and ridiculous performance, one that comes naturally to the willfully disobedient Pinocchio character. But what the Del Toro film recognizes is that sometimes submitting to authority is not wise. Sometimes disobedience is unambiguously morally correct. Anyway, as payment for this performance, the fascists shoot Pinocchio with a gun.
Shoot him!
Another new wrinkle to this version of the story is that Pinocchio, as a divinely animated puppet, is functionally immortal. When he dies, which he does several times in the film, he goes to a purgatory with a Tilda Swinton god creature and hangs out in stasis for a while, watching a big hourglass tick down before returning to the world of the living.
You know, now I'm kind of curious if this quote-unquote Tilda Swinton god creature is because this god creature is voiced by Tilda Swinton, or if it just kind of incidentally looks like her, because I could kind of see both being accurate statements there.
A while, watching a big hourglass tick down before returning to the
Both?
world of
Okay,
the
thank
living.
you, Chadwick.
Podesta, the fascist official of Pinocchio's town, doesn't care about any of that supernatural stuff, but he is interested in Pinocchio. After all, he's got an unkillable puppet made of good Italian pine. He's going to make him into a super soldier. In this telling, Lampwick, the poor boy who usually gets turned into a donkey on Pleasure Island, is instead the somewhat hapless son of Podesta, and Pleasure Island itself turns out to be, oh no, a military training camp for boys. Like the church or economic subjugation, the camp is yet another effort to tie down Italy's youth. Unlike Pleasure Island, the danger they face here is not limitless hedonism or bottomless root beer, but having their individuality wiped away to be replaced with state-sponsored violence. And once again, Pinocchio rebels. The puppet refuses to dehumanize his friends. There are 3 bad fathers in Del Toro's Pinocchio. Well, 4 if you count the state. 5 if you count God. Let's say 3. Each has a son who desperately wants to please them, but nevertheless can't abide by some aspect of their behavior. Spazzatura fights the ringmaster instead of letting him burn Pinocchio alive. Lampwick refuses to execute the puppet even when his dad commands him. Because each son refuses to do the morally indefensible, each son loses their father. Each, except for Pinocchio. Because in this story, unlike the ringmaster, unlike Podesta, unlike Collodi, Geppetto recognizes that fathers also need to change. He sees that humanity isn't awarded a single time for good behavior, but maintained through a continuous examination of the self. Geppetto recognizes that one son cannot simply replace another, that the joy of parentage is discovering who your child is, not deciding who they should be. And what of the puppet? No matter how you twist and turn the story, Pinocchio is a tale about a wooden boy becoming a real one. And this Pinocchio becomes real through yet another act of disobedient selflessness, making the choice to shatter his own immortality to save the ones he loves. I don't know what Carlo Collodi would have thought about Del Toro's Pinocchio, or any other adaptation for that matter. My guess is that he would be shocked that his story, written a chapter at a time for a children's magazine, had stretched so far, landed in the hands of so many artists. Perhaps he would be frustrated that the puppet had been softened into a largely blameless mascot, or bemused that his silly wooden boy became a vessel for existential dread. I would love to show him Lies of P, to which I assume he'd react, "Ow, what the f*** is that?" Before I started this journey, my initial reasoning for this story's popularity was a fairly cynical one. Pinocchio is a property in the public domain, popularized but not owned by Disney. He's a Cinderella, a Little Mermaid. This is partially true, I'm sure, but I don't think many great artists die regretting they never got to exploit the fact that a character exists in the public domain. I don't think
I haven't died yet, but I regret being unable to exploit those public domain characters every day of my life. No, but in all seriousness, I feel like those were some really strong points that he brought up, and I didn't want to step on his toes as he continued to build upon his case. And I really like the parallels between calling the state a type of poor father for Pinocchio and pointing out that there are economic burdens placed on families. I think is an excellent way of describing how there's always kind of strings attached and placed on people, even if they aren't the most visible kind of strings.
I think you get Freudian analysis, societal diagnoses, conversations with God, meditations on the core of humanity out of mere convenience. If nothing else, Pinocchio has proven himself to be endlessly malleable, not tied to strings or specific philosophies, able to cross mediums, generations, and countries. Maybe the story is just raw material in a skilled craftsman's hands, able to be born into whatever shape best fits the era. But there is a core to the puppet that is fittingly human. Despite Collodi's original plan to leave him wooden and hanging from a noose, the element of yearning for that indefinable quality of real defines every permutation. Pinocchio wants to be something more than himself, and over more than a century, the puppet has done exactly that, become real not just by the scale of his cultural impact, but because his constant struggle to understand the world, how he can fit into it, and how it can be shaped by him, defines humanity.
And this is kind of interesting because in many ways, I feel like this is the exact opposite take on what one would get from a more Eastern read on the problem of Pinocchio, because the fundamental issue within the story of Pinocchio is essentially like a non-issue when approaching it from a more like Buddhist perspective, because by saying Pinocchio wants to be a real boy, that kind of denies the current actual factual truth of what Pinocchio is. Pinocchio doesn't need to become a real boy. Pinocchio just needs to become Pinocchio, and only Pinocchio is Pinocchio. And trying to become something you're not kind of sets somebody up for failure, which might tie into the whole Guillermo del Toro twist at the end where he sacrifices his own immortality to save others. I mean, that isn't exactly like the whole like a Buddhist perspective on things, but this is just, I think, like one of the kinds of stories which might capture one of the quintessential philosophical problems inherent within the West, where we often define ourselves based upon the expectations of others, and I think we often feel as though we need a certain part of our identity to be validated from others when it really just comes from within. And being able to kind of break free of those constraints is one of the steps to becoming enlightened in the East. So that's just kind of like what comes to mind right now. And of course, like, this is a pretty premature take on things, but that's just what comes to mind now. Yeah. Joji says, the joy of parenting is absolutely shaping your son and then letting him become a better version of you. Pressures are necessary for growth, and if you're a successful role model, do not shy away from pushing your son to be more until you recognize their strength to push back and finally decide for themselves. That's very well said, and I think that's a very mature thing to say as well. And maybe a little bit, I don't want to say like a privileged one, but I can't think of a better word for it, because not always does a parent's child turn out the way that they would like them to, and not necessarily due to like too heavy of expectations, but because, not everybody goes down, let's say, a good path in their own lives. And so hopefully things work out the best for you, your children, and, everybody and everybody's children. But yeah, that's pretty rough, but nonetheless, I commend the kind of perspective that you have on it right now. Narcissistic validation to love your kids and to not shape them. And I feel like no matter what, there's going to be a bit of a pitfall to that. And to say to not shape your children, I think, is a little bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I guess, kind of literally in this figurative statement here, this little pun that I've made. So, yeah, I think like all parents strive for like the best for their children, but unfortunately, like, there's no established path to get that done. And part of the problem of having children is that they're all individuals, and what might work for one child does not work for another. And so, as I said earlier in the stream, I was a rapscallion as a youth, and I am very defiant towards authority, that is just kind of inherent. So I often challenge authority because to me, like, respect needs to be earned. It's not given. And it is way easier to lose respect than it is to earn it in my mind. So that is just a very undesirable quality here in the West, or even like in the East, especially, where authority should be kind of implicitly obeyed. But I mean, another like good benefit of the West is that, at least in the US specifically, we're very anti-authoritarian kind of as a rule, as a people, but also not, because we also strive to conform quite a bit. And so there's like a time and place to do things, but unfortunately that time and place is only ever settled after the fact, and after you kind of create a lot of waves, which isn't always the best thing. But I mean, that's just kind of one of the only ways to make progress, is to not follow the beaten path and to stand up for what is right and whatnot. Now, of course, like, the way that I spun things right there makes it sound like it's altruistic to not always obey authority and whatnot, but that's kind of contingent upon whether authority is being handled well or if it's being abused. Because if somebody's abusing their authority, then it's very easily justifiable to not obey their authority. But if somebody is using authority responsibly, then being a rebellious little shithead isn't necessarily the best or most desirable trait that somebody could have, which was a lot of the traits that I embodied, because believe it or not, I'm a little bit of a sarcastic asshole. So, yeah, did not work out super well for me at times being an immature kid. I can say that much. Absolutely. How do you even not shape your child? By going to the store and picking up a pack of cigarettes. Hey, Clownscum, welcome back. Why are we sculpting kids? So that way they're like us, but better. Yeah, and Amin says that societal pressure is unavoidable, to be honest. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really wild how much of societal pressures are just kind of picked up subliminally as you just kind of exist in society, no matter how sheltered you are, to be honest.
Just as much as flesh and blood. Once upon a time, there was a grand metaphor for life and death and everything.
42.
No, you're mistaken. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. I know what you're thinking. Jacob, aren't you forgetting something? Jacob, you only talked about 2 of the 3 Pinocchio films that came out in 2022. When are we going to hear about the animated Marvel Pinocchio, a true story starring none other than Pauly Shore?
I'm a boy and I'm alive!
Hi, Jacob from the future here. You can tell because my beard is growing in and I look like I've spent the last 40 hours editing. The true reason that Pinocchio, a true story, wasn't included in this essay is it's simultaneously too light and way too much to include in this otherwise somewhat professional video. But I did watch it, and ended up still talking about it for almost an hour, and you can see that video exclusively on Nebula. And Pinocchio's like, okay, horse, you've gotta be my dad now.
If I were an audience member, I would be like, What's the bit here?
Looks like Pinocchio fails a QuickTime event. If you're new here, Nebula is a streaming service where I, along with other favorite creators,
Pinocchio
like
fails a
Philosophy
QuickTime
Tube,
event.
Rasputin, or whole
I don't
shows
know
like
why
Jet
that line
Lag,
is so funny
post
to
their
me.
stuff early and often with exclusive additions. Here's a gaming metaphor. Joining Nebula now is kind of like buying a console after it's already been out for several years, and suddenly you have an entire generation of amazing games that you can explore right away. Much like that metaphor, Nebula is also cheap, only $2.50 a month when you follow my link. Check out all the exclusive videos I and other creators made last year, or Nebula classes, or my exclusive podcasts, or hey, just skip all that and watch us try to comprehend what this movie could be doing with Pinocchio.
Right, it's like the horse is like, you think you want to see a movie where Pinocchio's nose grows. They're like, yeah,
Yes,
that would
we
be
do.
more fun.
In any case, Nebula is your best opportunity to get more of the creators you love, support us in making more stuff sustainably, And do it all for very little money. Join today and get 40% off an annual subscription by going to nebula.tv/Jacob Geller.
Close your eyes. Come to me. Feel alright.
Alright, that looks like it's pretty much it. That was a really well done video. Quite impressive. I'm curious as to what other stuff he's made, so I'm gonna look at his channel here in a second. But for anybody who wants to give Jacob Geller some support, go ahead and follow the link that I posted in the chat. Give them a like and or a sub if you're so inclined. So this is my first time watching any of his videos, but yeah, that was really nice. Best in Games 2023. Oh, I remember seeing this, like thumbnail and whatnot. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and sub to him. You'd recommend his Fear of Cold video? I would need to like look into it because I don't know if like that's a Dark Souls thing or if like Fear of Cold is completely different. Fear of Drowning is one of your favorites too? Okay.
Once again.
All right, so yeah, no, that was a really nice video from Jacob Geller. Reacted to it for a little bit longer than I thought I would, but I mean, that's just kind of, I feel like I'm reacting things just longer in general now. Maybe because I'm bouncing more off of chat because it's a bit more active. So I might just need to like recalibrate my internal sense of how long it takes for me to get through some videos at times, which isn't a bad thing. It's maybe a good thing that I'm having this problem, but I don't know. That's the moment Geller became Heisenberg. Dr. N says the Outer Wilds video by him is also fantastic. So we talked about this on my Lies of P stream a week or two ago, where I cannot tell the difference between Outer Wilds and Outer Worlds because they came out at like around the same time, and the titles are too similar in my mind that I don't know the difference between them, and I need to like rewatch both of the trailers and try to set myself straight. Because I know one of the games is kind of like a space Fallout clone, but I don't know what the other one is, like, at all. Okay, so anyway, that was a great video by Jacob Geller. Now we'll go ahead and do something completely different with Noctugals from Valkyries to Giants, Elden Ring's mythological web. Okay, so Outer Worlds is the Fallout clone, and then Outer Wilds is an utterly amazing game. Outer Worlds was it's another open world RPG. Okay, I still don't know what Outer Wilds is then, but I've heard good things about it, I think.
I will be highlighting some comments that relate to Elden Ring, and several characters' connections and parallels to mythological sources, namely Marika, Ranni, and Radagon, among others. The first commenter goes by the username of Rube3117, and I am very appreciative of this commenter taking the time to share their thoughts with me, and for allowing me to share them with all of you. Before we hop into it, I recently was accepted to the YouTube Partner Program and just added a single membership tier to my channel. So, if you feel so inclined, you can click the join button below this video and become a channel sponsor, which includes early access to videos as well as several other great perks. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more nerdy content like this. Without further ado, let's hear what Rube3117 had to say. I wonder if Marika being Odin explains how Marika is connected to Melina. Odin had one eye, liked to disguise himself and travel, and rode a magic steed just like Melina. And Marika was said to like to disguise herself too. Also, maybe the Finger Maidens are Valkyries? They lead the Tarnished to Leyndell, like the Valkyries led people who died in battle to Asgard. Which makes me think of Marika sending away the Tarnished in the first place. Maybe she was preparing for her Ragnarok? Finally, I think Ranni may actually be a reference to Hel, who appeared half living and half dead, just like Ranni does. She was also involved in the story of Baldur's death. In that case, I think Radagon would actually be Loki. Loki's three children with the giantess were Hel, Jormungandr, and Fenrir. I think this may have been the inspiration for the Carian royal family. Rennala is an astrologer whose ancestors had ties to the fire giants. Jormungandr was a giant serpent, just like Rykard. Not sure about Radon, though, and Fenrir. Loki's children were prophesized to start Ragnarok, which mirrors...
And so this is one of the things that I simultaneously like and dislike about a lot of the outside parallels of talking about games, which is why I try to do it very sparingly, and I try to stay as grounded as I can when I can do it, which is a little bit hypocritical of me to say, because obviously I talk a lot about the Japanese side of things and how FromSoft may have like some cultural context buried within the language of Japanese itself, which isn't necessarily accessible to a Western audience. And so like those concepts of Kegare and Yodomi, or like impurity and stagnation, those are kind of like outside examples which might not be completely applicable to these worlds. I feel like just the ideas themselves are very easily apparent from the games, that just using Shinto as a basis for explanation of systems is might be a little bit more fair than this. And so, while even I do think that Elden Ring could have been inspired quite a lot by Norse mythology, I think one common pitfall people have in trying to do this style of analysis is trying to impose the framework a bit too strongly on all other aspects of the game. So, while there might be some validity to saying that Odin might be comparable to Marika and perhaps also Melina, and or like Ronnie could be like Hel, I feel like once you start trying to fit like every character that ever existed in the Ada or Ida, I don't know how to pronounce it, into Elden Ring, then you're just kind of getting into the problem of having a hammer and seeing all future problems as being able to be nails that you can hammer down, if you catch my drift there. So with that being said, there might still be like some valid comments here and there, but I think it's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot and kind of dig your own grave by applying it too strongly. And just to kind of like go full circle, this is kind of what I often refer to as the Rorschach test of like video game lore, where people are just able to look at one thing, come to their own conclusions, and kind of support their own conclusions with their own headcanon, which is, you know, that's just kind of like the name of the game there. But anyway, Norse mythology copied Tolkien. all right, howdy. That Marvel Loki fan art, though. Dr. N wishes you could get more Japanese lore channels or give recommendations if there are good ones. So I don't know of any that have gone into Elden Ring yet. Was it Garrulous Goldmask? He might have brought something up, but then like I noticed he had a couple issues with that, so he might have been relying on outside sources. So part of the reason why we don't have so many channels like that to begin with is, in order to even be able to parse Elden Ring lore, you kind of need to have a small subsect of people that are like into that thing to begin with. And then within that group, you also need people to be fluent enough in Japanese to be able to compare the English and the Japanese versions of the game. And then within that subtext or subsect of people, you need to have the people with either the time or dedication and commitment to look at the larger body of work and find out if there's any consistencies or inconsistencies which need to be highlighted. And then even within that smaller subsect of people, within these like three other subsects so far, you need to have people who have the technical skill to actually produce the lore videos, the time to produce it, the equipment in terms of like gathering the footage, capture cards perhaps, microphones for voice recording, the patience to do all of this stuff. So really you're just casting a smaller smaller net the deeper you go down the rabbit hole. So yeah, good luck with that. I know like Shitani's Lair does a lot of Sekiro stuff, which is really good because like Sekiro is a great game, but not one that particularly interests me. And I know in addition to my channel, which covered like a lot of Bloodborne lore, Aruki Mania is still consistently covering Bloodborne based stuff with his Translationborn project. He came out with another video like Thursday or Friday, which is really good, and I commented on it. I posted a link to it in the Discord and everything. And for Dark Souls, there was Loki, although he and I have like quite a bit of a disagreement on things. And yeah, other than that, I think like most other comments on translations are just going to be like from randos, whether that be Reddit or random forum posts or like 4chan. And that has its own host of issues in terms of like validating the claims that are made. And so with those kind of like posts and whatnot, you don't have a lot of consistency or even ability to interact with people consistently. So I'm trying to use two different versions of consistency there. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of why I think there aren't more channels that are devoted to it. And then also, even though like I know like a good chunk of Japanese, I don't necessarily know like everything about Shintoism, Buddhism, or like Japanese culture. And so ideally you would want to have a Japanese native talk about that. But even if you did have a native Japanese speaking person, they might not be able to understand some of the nuances that are different in the English, or be able to convey some of those differences or in like a clear and concise way. And that's like kind of another set of issues and like hoops to jump through. So hopefully that makes sense, and sorry for going on a so long tangent there. Joji says, do you think Elden Ring sells as well in Japan as it does in the West? Oh yeah, definitely. Maybe arguably more so, but I would need to look at like populace comparisons to give you a better answer. Yeah, and then Chadwick, so you can even look at the lands between as like an ersatz British Isles. Caelid is Scotland, Liurnia is Wales, etc. So it's fair to read Elden Ring as a historic allegory as well in a few different ways. Absolutely. But it's also Fist of the North Star, so you don't know. All right, Howdy, you have a good night if you're still hanging around, and you take care, man. You hate comparing Renala's children to Loki's kids because they always get to Fenrir and just go, yeah, he's Radahn, I guess. That's Blythe. Radahn is just Raoul. So if you think I'm kind of an expert on Shinto, and okay, so this kind of got brought up right before stream as well because Sinclair Lore and Sophie Pilbeam released like another video. Let me look at it real quick. The Bastard's Curse 2 Death Force Dark Souls lore. And I need to add that to my list. But yeah, they'd asked me to like say something for them about Shinto, and I was like, I kind of don't want to do that because I don't want to like misconstrue myself as an expert. Like, sure, I might know like a bit more than the layman just because I'm a bit more familiar, but I'm not like, you know, crazy fluent in that stuff by any means. So I kind of denied the request just because I didn't want to misrepresent things. So, all right, let's go back to the video here.
Ronnie and Rykard conspiring on the night of the Black Knives. Okay, so I absolutely love Rube's connections between Melina and Odin, as there are certainly several, including the magical horse steed, the missing eye, and the element of disguise. Finger Maidens as Valkyries is also a great possible connection, as they do point you in the direction you need to go, similar to Valkyries leading fallen soldiers to the halls of Valhalla. Moreover, Melina certainly has more knowledge than we sometimes give her credit for, and I do wonder if she has some sort of prescience or foresight similar to Odin, and knows which ending the Tarnished will choose. Rube's references to Ronnie actually being inspired by Hel, or Hela as is more commonly known now, is also a stellar insight, as Ronnie is a very unique character in the roles she plays, as well as her physical state could imply many sources of inspiration and mythological parallels. Hel was certainly involved in the story of Baldur's death, though Hel wasn't directly implicated in his assassination as far as I can recall. Though Ronnie's physical state of effectively being both dead and alive certainly does mirror the depictions of the goddess Hel in Norse stories. The assertion that Radagon is...
Wasn't it Loki that it inadvertently caused Baldur to die? Because I know there's the mistletoe thing, and then Loki used his poisoned, honeyed words to make somebody get mad at Baldur, the golden child. And I think it was like the blacksmith. I'm pretty bad with those details on Norse mythology, but anyway, who did he compare Loki to a moment ago? I can't even remember. So Loki did it personally? Is that right? I thought he tricked somebody else to do it. Okay, yeah, just correct me in the comments, and I'd appreciate that.
Is more akin to Loki is awesome, and I love the parallels drawn here, as I can absolutely see this inspiring the Carian royal family.
Oh yeah, it was literally on the page Radagon is more akin to Loki. So yeah, I don't necessarily think I would agree with that reading that like Radagon killed Baldur, but anyway, that's kind of like why I try not to take this stuff too seriously or too strongly. I think they can be good reference guides, but I would just kind of treat them as reference guides, as like templates, rather than anything like one-to-one. Kratos killed Baldur? Damn, you got me. Oh no. Okay. Thanks, Doctor, and I appreciate that.
And I love the parallels drawn here, as I can absolutely see this inspiring the Carian royal family. While we still don't really know Ronnie's parental lineage, it's known she was at the very least adopted by Ronaldo. And this could fit with Rube's assertion that Ronnie is actually Hel, as Hel is one of the children of Loki. And like Rube said, Rijkaard is a shoo-in for the representation of the World Eater Jormungandr, a massive serpent that is again the child of Loki. For Radon, perhaps the comment about him feasting on friends and foes alike as if he were a dog could be a subtle reference to Radon's role as Fenrir, the wolf that is meant to devour Odin. Though maybe the red wolf of Radagon is more of a direct inspiration, as it is a literal wolf with a clear connection to Radagon in some way. I do agree with Rube's overall assessment here though, as the parallels seem evident, as it is the children of Loki who aid in the start and completion of Ragnarok, just as Ronnie and Rijkaard conspired to assassinate Godwin. Now, we move on to several comments posted by a commenter who goes,
Doesn't Fenrir kill the sun in Ragnarok? If so, I could kind of see the comparisons between Rijkaard and Fenrir, because like he's the conqueror of the stars and whatnot, even though I don't think it works super well. But anyway.
By the username The Cranky Old Man. Much appreciation for writing all this out, and I'm excited to share it, so let's connect some more dots. I do believe that Ronnie is actually Vali.
Fenrir's does? Okay, thank you.
Rinder, Rind, or Rinda. For the purposes of the rest of this, I'm going to go with Rinda, because it's just a little bit easier in my mind to stick with. But there is a conflict in the story where Vali is sometimes addressed as either Odin or Loki's child, but Vali is associated with vengeance and retribution and tied to Baldur's death. The two Vali personalities follow a completely different path, and I do believe that Marika and Radagon represent Loki and Odin. Many people didn't know, but Loki loses an eye as well, and it makes much more sense based on what happens in the game to Carl Jung's human psyche concept, where the shattering results in Marika locking away the shadow part of herself, and there is a struggle between the anima and animus. So, see it more as a Loki trying to become an Odin, because that is required by the greater will in the Golden Order, and combine all of that with the traditional Gnostic story, the Fall of Sophia. The Fall of Sophia is a Gnostic story about how God created aeons, and how one of the aeons was the Aeon of Wisdom Sophia. Sophia got curious in making something of herself, which resulted in a demiurge.
Now, this is making me think about like more Lies of P connections with the, Sophia connection there. So anyway.
The demiurge also wanted to create something himself, so he created the material world. God and the Aeons were not too happy though, and banished Sophia to the material world that her demiurge created. She first travels around the world, looking for a way to redeem herself, but in the end it becomes more about her spiritual awakening, and the struggles between good and evil. She travels the world with a redeemer. In most media that uses this type of world building as their foundation, They normally add the idea of a demiurge overthrowing an existing world that was originally inhabited by dragons or ancients. But there is also always an original civilization that gets cursed, wiped out, banished, or used for experiments. The demiurge always plays the role of the primordial one, who wants to take suffering away from the world, and there will always be a small group of rebels that goes against the demiurge. This demiurge is often depicted as a being of ignorance and arrogance, responsible for trapping the divine spark within humans in the material world. The forbidden knowledge story is tied to Eve obtaining the forbidden knowledge and God banishing mankind and cursing them. Even though God expected that Eve-like character would obtain the forbidden knowledge, since his creations are considered flawed. Obtaining the forbidden knowledge results in the world being divided into 7 realms, ruled by 7 archons, with 7 gnosis, and a lot of the times tied to the 7 deadly sins. It's a very common story used in a lot of video games, like Final Fantasy VII, the Persona series, and the Shin Megami Tensei series.
I was gonna say, I know I saw like earlier today or this weekend, Max Durat had a video, or Durat, I'm really bad with names, about like how the number 7 shows up all the time in religion. And then I saw another video by him where like the number 3 shows up all the time in religion. And while both can certainly exist, it's just kind of funny to say that they both show up all the time, because like maybe 4 also shows up all the time, or 5 or 6 or 8, because we already said 7. But anyway, that's not too important.
And Genshin Impact. Especially Genshin Impact uses the same exact world building, but it's normally not a game the Elden Ring fan wants to be associated with. But it involved the Firmament, Yggdrasil, the dragons, the first civilization, the Moon Sisters, the Serpent, the Philosopher's Stone, immortality, creation of gold, and Norse mythology. Evangelion, the anime, is a good example of other media using the same blueprint. It's basically a combination of stories. One is the story of the creation wanting to create something that's better than its creator, such as David in the Aliens movie. The other is the law between good and evil.
Wait, is that supposed to be the Ava connection? Because I'd kind of disagree with that. In many ways, I feel like the whole thing with Ava is kind of more akin to the origins of Jainism, I think, or some other Eastern religion. I don't necessarily want to say Hinduism, but I know there's like a couple different tales which it could apply to, but I don't want to misspeak here, so I just won't speak on that more right now. Anyway.
Of stories. One is the story of the creation wanting to create something that's better than its creator, such as David in the Aliens movie. The other is the law between good and evil. What is actually good, and what is actually evil, and what will be the best outcome for this conflict. I will say, the Loki and Odin part of Norse mythology is quite a complex tale, and I think there are plenty of references where we can somewhat learn the roles that the Elden Ring characters have been picked for, but doesn't follow everything perfectly. The story in a sense becomes less complex and convoluted, but at the same time adds its own unique mystery. The story of Vali, for example, is tied to his brother Narfi. Vali kills his brother while being in wolf form, and Narfi's intestines are used to bind Loki, as a punishment for killing Baldur. Even though both children of Loki, they were raised by Fula, who is Frigg's handmaiden, and Frigg being Odin's wife. We know Rani was raised by Renala, and that she also learned a lot from the Snow Witch. I'm pretty sure the Snow Witch, based on the previous paragraph, would have a strong tie to Marika. And
I'm not gonna lie, my dyslexia read that as Velka for a second, and I was like, oh, mother of God. So I read Marika as Velka, and like kind of pooped a brick, metaphorically speaking, there for a second. What was I gonna say before I just totally got brain jacked by this? Yeah, I think I was just going to harp on how I think some of these can be like good blueprints for the games, but I wouldn't trust them too strongly because a lot of these parallels are just kind of universal in many cultures. And what I mean by universal is even though like the characters might change, a lot of the story beats might be pretty similar overall, which is why I think you can compare the story of Elden Ring to the mythology of the Norse or the ancient Egyptians, or like that of Jainism to an extent, or, you know, the early British Isles, or even Fist of the North Star, as Chadwick would say, I think. And then Stella, or even like Gnosticism. And then Stella said, Liza P has you convinced the devs saw all the From Game Theory vids about alchemy and Gnosticisms and went, sure, let's do that, maybe.
Based on the previous paragraph, would have a strong tie to Marika. And I do think Ronnie and Blyde reference Bali and Narfi. That being said, something I don't see enough of about is the Cuckoo Knights. The cuckoo is a parasitic bird that deposits its egg into a host's nest, which then incubates and feeds the chick that hatches, even at the expense of its own offspring. Just based on that description alone, we know that Renala isn't the biological mother of at least one of Radagon's kids. The Empyrean one is 100% adopted.
And I would kind of strongly disagree with that, based on how Renala is called Ronnie's mother, and some people might argue that, you know, somebody's mother isn't necessarily their biological mother, but I'll just say that I feel like that's very much playing a game of mental gymnastics to fit a certain worldview. And if you can doubt something as simple as saying like somebody is another character's mother, I feel like for me personally, that just kind of leads to a breakdown in communication where you can get extremely pedantic about every single word, and it just becomes not very conducive to having meaningful, good faith conversations. And so I'll just kind of like leave that there for a bit, maybe, and try to move on from that. And Dr. N says that makes no sense. Ronnie is one child of hers that has explicitly strong bonds with her and her corpse. Yeah, and that, like, those are other fair points to bring up, and I feel like this is just, it goes a little bit too far for me into like really entertain it in good faith to suggest that Renala is Ronnie's adopted parent. But that's just, you know, like my taste, and people are free to disagree.
But I think it's safe to say that the other two were adopted as well, and that's why Renala cares so much for the Amber Egg. Another thing you might find interesting is the first part.
And so adopted as well, like when you say that, that kind of opens yourself up to asking the question of, okay, then who is their true parent? And this also comes with other stipulations which are problematic, in that the great runes of Rykard and Radon say that they became demigod stepchildren when Radagon wed Renala, when Radagon wed Marika, which implies that if they're like of Karian descent, that there's like some legal stuff to go along with this. I don't know, it just becomes more convoluted, not technically impossible, but I feel like it just ends up being very short-sighted to say something like this.
Part of a Norse myth by Prozetta called the Gjalfaginning. In the Gjalfaginning, Odin gives information about the creation of the world, the cosmology of the Norse universe, the different realms such as Asgard and Midgard, and the impending events of Ragnarok to a mortal king called Gylfi. One of the things Odin shares with Gylfi is the role of Surtur. Surtur is a powerful fire giant, who is the one that actually sets the world ablaze, which would result in the rebirth of the cosmos. The fire sword that Surtur uses is called the Surtalogi. Surtur is considered the descendant of Ymir, the primordial Jotun, first of the giants. To start off my response to the cranky old man, I love the addition of Vali in these connections, as Vali was born with his sole purpose being to avenge the death of Baldur by slaying Hoder, which is honestly kind of messed up when you think about it, because he really had no idea that he was aiding in the assassination of Baldur in the first place. Though I'm not sure it's clear what is meant when the cranky old man says that there are two different Vali personalities, and while I suppose this could be tied to the confusing parentage of Vali being a child of either Loki or Odin, there's actually only a single line that references Vali as a son of Loki. There may have also been numerous mistranslations that led to this belief, though there are many references of Vali being a son of Odin, and his ability to transform into a wolf is actually an ability that Odin grants to his warriors. Thus, Vali may represent a berserker, and is also said to be one of the gods that survives the doom of Ragnarok, which can be seen as fitting with Ronnie's character. I also appreciate how much the cranky old man has contemplated all of this, even bringing in that Carl Jung information like a neo-Jordan Peterson, but only for Elden Ring. The addition of the Gnostic connections is also awesome, as I have referenced Gnosticism in previous videos, and I love learning more about these subjects. To add on to what the cranky old man said, I wonder if the Demiurge could be paralleled by the Greater Will itself in Elden Ring. I wasn't clear what the cranky old man's thoughts were about what the Demiurge would be representative of in Elden Ring, so cranky old man, let me know down below what you think the Demiurge is in Elden Ring. Anyway, as the Demiurge is typically seen as a lesser deity that shapes the material world and traps the divine spark within the material realm, then perhaps the Greater Will is a stand-in for the Demiurge, a being that fashions and maintains the physical universe much like the Greater Will shapes and maintains the laws of the lands between, including how death operates. Some groups of Gnostics viewed the Demiurge as evil, as it was too concerned with attempting to control the material world rather than devoting itself to God and spiritual reality. Though, if this connection were to be real, it draws into question the hierarchy of the outer gods, as we have so far seen the Greater Will to be the most powerful outer god, that we don't have any evidence to suggest that the Greater Will is actually the true primordial being of the universe, and could align more with a lesser creative deity like the Demiurge. And the connection to Marika could make all the more sense, as she would have a direct connection to the Elden Ring's version of the Demiurge, making Marika the Sophia from the Gnostic tale. Oh, and how Marika has fallen by the start of the game. The Demiurge can also be sometimes viewed as the cause of the issue of evil in the world. The inclusion of the Demiurge and how the story of a creator wanting to create something better in the dichotomy of good and evil is amazing, as it absolutely appears to tie into Elden Ring, and From Software seems to really love pulling from that blueprint. Now, to discuss the connections between Ranni and Blaidd to Vali and Narfi, which by the way, it's spelled Nafri in the comment, but the character in Norse mythology is Narfi. While not always described as siblings, though it does make the death of Narfi all the more horrifying if done by a brother, I like this connection, and how it could relate to the connection of the previous commenter, Rube. If Ranni is indicative of Vali, then it would be fitting for her to not only be a parallel for a child of Loki, but also to have been adopted by someone else, in this case Rennala, who, if Rube is correct, had children with the Loki stand-in Radagon. Though if Rennala were to be Rinda, then it would mean Radagon would be synonymous with Odin. And I feel as though Marika could be more fitting for the Odin role, whereas Radagon could perhaps represent Loki insofar as he has been trapped, bound to Marika against his will, much like Loki is bound in myths by the body of another. I can also see how Ranni and Blaidd could parallel Vali and Narfi, as Ranni does ultimately kill Blaidd, just as Vali kills Narfi, and this act helps permanently seal away Radagon and Marika, just as Narfi's death helped to seal away Loki. Radagon paralleling Loki, as I previously mentioned, would align with Rube's earlier comment.
So, one of the questions that I think need to be asked when we try to bring in these parallels from the other mythologies or works or pieces of fiction would be, how does this help us get better informed about the story that we currently have? And I think one of the struggles of comparing Elden Ring to Norse mythology is that it doesn't give us a ton of extra detail to help recontextualize certain aspects of Elden Ring. Now, with that being said, I do think there still could be some parallels which can actually be quite formative about the state of Elden Ring. So, for example, if Marika is supposed to be a kind of stand-in for Odin, then Odin kind of being crucified into the Yggdrasil and kind of gaining the knowledge of runes might be applicable to how Marika took the blessings of the Erd Tree and disseminated it amongst her followers in the lands between, because there could be a good possibility that the blessings of the Erd Tree are essentially runes, and if Marika is the bestower of blessings, then she's ipso facto the disseminator of runes as well. So there can be some validity to it, and it can help us help inform us about the game. But I feel like some of this more nebulous stuff just doesn't do as good a job as I would like for me to kind of get on board with it.
And if Rennala didn't have any offspring of her own, then it could be especially fitting for Ranni to be a stand-in for Vali, specifically the version that is the child of Loki, who in this case would be Radagon. To cap it off, while the cranky old man doesn't draw the connection, the fire giant in Elden Ring could certainly parallel Surtur in many ways. The obvious connection being that Surtur is a giant, and the giants have a connection to the primordial being Ymir, and I have likened Ymir to the Crucible of Elden Ring in past videos. It's fitting that the giants in Elden Ring would have a connection to a separate outer god, and that they could even have a connection to the Crucible, as this could align with the giants in Norse mythology being largely toppled by the Aesir gods, who in many ways are represented through the Greater Will in the Golden Order. Once again, a massive thank you to Rube3117 and the Cranky Old Man.
And so, one other thing that goes along with this is, how do you then describe the characters that are like missing in Elden Ring, yet were present in the Ada, or whatever you want to call it, and like, how come those characters aren't paralleled then? Or other aspects of Norse mythology not quite fitting Elden Ring, like where would Niflheim be if you want to like compare like the realms of the Aesir and whatnot to the lands between. So of course we don't have like the full image of the lands between. There might be more to discover with that, but that's just kind of where I'm at with all that.
Comments, theories, and insights have been amazing to read and dissect and research. I love being able to interact with people watching my videos. It's been super fun so far. I love how many people vibe with the mythology connections as well. I also just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who has been supporting my content and interacting with it. I really never thought that I would actually become a YouTube partner, but this is my first video as an official partner, and it just feels so surreal to say that. It's crazy to think that I could possibly make this my job one day, at some point, rather than just a little hobby that I do after work, and that's so wild to me, and I have all of you to thank for that. So without those of you watching, I never would have gotten to this point, and I deeply appreciate the positive support I've received from some of you, and I also just launched a membership tier, so you can now become a channel sponsor for just $1.99 a month. And so if you're interested in helping to support the channel and allow me to make higher quality videos, then consider becoming a channel sponsor, though no pressure at all about that. I've made it this far with pretty much no budget at all, and I'll just keep on climbing. But until next time, peace out.
Hell yeah. Moving on up in the world there. So even though I do have like a lot of disagreements with some of the content in the video, I do appreciate a lot of the Gnostic connections, and I think it's a pretty good video. It stays very grounded in establishing that these are the perspectives of others, and it doesn't try to say like, oh, this is like the one-to-one aspect of Elden Ring's lore to Norse mythology. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a like. And as always, I will share in to chat with you guys if you want to give Noctigal some support as well. Without Horn says, you're a bit behind the video. You had no idea that Odin was connected to runes? In Norse myth, is that just like literally he figures out the secret of written language? Or, so it's kind of complicated. I don't exactly remember the origins of why he hangs himself or crucifies himself onto Yggdrasil, like depending on the version of the story that you're reading. And I think first he has to like talk to Mimir. Oh, okay, wait, no, it's starting to come back to me. I think, I mean, ideally I should just like look it up really quickly right here for you guys and give you like the direct answer, but I kind of want to test my knowledge. I think Odin crucified himself so that way he could get the knowledge of being able to overcome like Ragnarok, and he also learns the power of runes and like uses Mimir for advice as to like what he needs to do to become like a suitable like sacrifice to gain this kind of knowledge and all that stuff. But yeah, the runes are connected to Odin explicitly there. Like he learns the power of runes. So I'm just going to go ahead and Google it. Okay. Hopefully this is pretty, what's the word? Succinct? All right. All right, that looks pretty good for you guys on screen. So, runes and magic. Runes are woven into Norse religion and are closely associated with Norse magic, Sather, and skaldic poetry. The runes were not invented. The old poem Havamal explains that Odin discovered the runes when he hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil in order to learn wisdom. He hung on the windblown tree for 9 nights and days. Just as he was about to die, he found the runes, grabbed them, and earned his life. A more prosaic explanation is that the runes were developed in the first century AD, possibly inspired by the Latin alphabet. Although used by all Germanic peoples, most of them, however, are discovered in Scandinavia. Runes have a form such that they're easy to carve into a hard material. Okay, it's not so important. So this is just like little runes and whatnot. Memorial stones used as magic symbols. Runic magic was used to foretell the future as a form of protection, to cast spells, to cure illness, bestow love. It could, however, be fairly risky if runes were carved by unskilled persons. Okay. Not too important. Okay, so that kind of looks like it for this site at least. Okay, so the Norse god Odin is a relentless seeker after knowledge and wisdom and is willing to sacrifice almost anything for this pursuit. The most outstanding feature of his appearance, his one eye, attests to this. He sacrificed his other eye for more wisdom. The tale of how he discovered the runes is another example of his unquenchable thirst for understanding the mysteries of life, not to mention his unstoppable will. Blah, blah, blah. Runes are like letters, secret mystery. At the center of the Norse cosmos stands the great tree Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil's upper branches cradle Asgard, the home and fortress of the Aesir gods and goddesses, of whom Odin is the chief. Yggdrasil grows out of the Well of Erd, a pool whose fathomless depths hold many of the most powerful forces and beings in the cosmos. Among these beings are the Norns, three sagacious maidens who create the fates of all beings. One of the foremost techniques they use to shape fate is carving runes into Yggdrasil's trunk. The symbols then carry these intentions throughout the tree, affecting everything in the nine worlds. Odin watched the Norns from his seat in Asgard and envied their powers and their wisdom, and he bent his will toward the task of coming to know the runes. Since the runes' native home is in the Well of Erd with the Norns, and since the runes do not reveal themselves to any but those who prove themselves worthy of such fearful insights and abilities, Odin hung himself from a branch of Yggdrasil, pierced himself with his spear, and peered downward into the shadowy waters below. He forbade any of the other gods to grant him the slightest aid, not even a sip of water, and he stared downward and called to the runes. He survived in this state, teetering on the precipice that separates the living from the dead for no less than 9 days and nights. At the end of the 9th night, he at last perceived shapes in the depths of the runes. Perceived shapes in the depths, the runes. He had accepted his sacrifice and shown them. They had accepted his sacrifice and shown themselves to him, revealing to him not only their forms, but also the secrets that lie within them. Having fixed this knowledge in his formidable memory, Odin ended his ordeal with a scream of exultation. Okay, so that just kind of gives a little bit more in-depth of an account as to what happened. But yeah, Odin discovered the runes, and something I kind of forgot about or didn't take enough notice of was that he discovered them while he was on the brink of life and death, which I think is very relevant to the way knowledge is presented in FromSoft games, and gaining kind of arcane knowledge is kind of contingent upon exceeding the bounds between life and death. And then Stella says, you got to be careful with runes and magic research because there's a lot of stuff that was made up in the 1800s. Exactly. And that's kind of like one of the challenges of looking up a lot of these mythologies in general, because there's not a lot of good academic sources which are readily available, and also kind of not already jumped off the deep end. So I'm trying to think of something that I was trying to actually do legitimate research on, but was having a remarkable amount of difficulty getting something that wasn't like super astrology crystal tier like hogwash. Anyway, I can't remember exactly what I was looking up, but it might have been related to I feel like I was having oh, okay, it's starting to come back to me. So it had to do with things with Bloodborne. I don't think it was the runes specifically, but it was something kind of similar. It had to do with like the history of the occult. I'm trying to remember the name of like the book. And I can't remember the name of the dude that I was trying to like look into, but anyway, if you try to like look up esoteric stuff, it's just kind of like one of the worst things you could do. Oh, another one would be okay, this is the best example that I have so far. So, when I was looking into Dark Souls 3, I noticed that Hazel was called the ring finger Hazel, I think, in English, but I think she's called Yellow Finger in Japanese. Damn it, I don't remember what they like the weird word for the finger was. Anyway, I was trying to look into this, and anytime I try to like look into ancient Chinese medicine style mythology, it is just such a pain in the ass between like people giving their hokey interpretations on things. So like, essentially like fake ass holistic medicine versus an actual academic account of what people believed within certain time periods about the body and medicine. And that is just a real mess to try to explore. And anyway, the long story short with like the ring finger Hazel is that it had to deal with like medicine or something like that. And so yeah, it's not really too important in the grand scheme of things. You could probably like look it up in the Discord and maybe find it. But anyway. Okay, so she's called Yellowfinger in the English. Okay. So maybe it was that Yellowfinger meant ring finger. That might make more sense to me. Okay. So anyway, yeah, that was a pretty entertaining video. Learned a bit more about Gnosticism, and especially after playing like Lies of P, it's starting to become more distinct in my mind. I like how that kind of a system works there. So next, let's go ahead and check out The Wisdom of the Stone by Elden Tales.
The earliest recorded uses of crystals in esoteric practices date back to the ancient Sumerians, who wrote magic formulas that included crystals around 5,000 years ago. Around the same time, the ancient Chinese were using crystals in medicinal practices and crystal-tipped needles in acupuncture. The ancient Egyptians buried their dead with
Fudge, I was muted, wasn't I? Damn it. Okay. Where did I start off with this? Okay, so I read Stella's comment, right? Oh, yeah, okay. So Stella said the good sources for that kind of history probably aren't in English. So, yeah, and I was saying that one of the difficulties for me is that even if those sources aren't in English, I don't have enough of an understanding of what I'm trying to look up in the first place to even parse it naturally in like Japanese, or even to try to figure out like what the Chinese roots of it are. So it just kind of becomes like a shot in the dark, and it takes a lot more time to figure out, because like that, I just don't know enough about like acupuncture and medicine in English, let alone Japanese, let alone freaking ancient Chinese, to understand where these references could ultimately come from. So when I look at FromSoft games, I often rely on having the text dump available for both English and Japanese, because there's kind of like a similar issue there of where we might have provided an English translation of something in the official localization of the game. I won't necessarily be able to type in the Japanese equivalent of what we're given in English and find that item description like immediately if I go to like a Japanese wiki for like Sekiro or something. And so it's just a lot more convenient to have both versions side by side, so I can compare what the official Japanese says versus the official English, because it isn't going to be a one-to-one match for many instances. And I think like one of the weirder examples was like the snake hearts in Sekiro, where like they're called persimmons in English, right? But it's essentially like the pericardium in Japanese, I think. It's been a long time since I looked at that. I would need to double check. But anyway, yeah, so that's just kind of one of the issues of trying to go down that rabbit hole and find actual good academic sources, because quite often trying to like look up this stuff, you're just going to get the hokey, holistic medicine type stuff rather than what you're actually looking for. And that's going to be an issue like for anything, even like me looking at random things in English, like you said, with like, be careful of looking up things about runes, because you're going to get a bunch of like crap that they just made up in the 1800s. So kind of like the same principle applies.
With crystals of all kinds to provide spiritual support in the afterlife, and the ancient Greeks thought that rubbing crushed crystals over their bodies made them invincible. In Plato's account of Atlantis, crystal healing is also mentioned. According to Plato, the Atlanteans used crystals to read minds and transmit thoughts. The practice of scrying, a form of divination said to derive from analyzing reflections in the water, metal, or precious stones, has likely been practiced since prehistoric time. But the use of crystal balls can be traced to the ancient Druids, who lived in the British Isles and parts of France during the Iron Age, as noted by Roman author, naturalist, philosopher, and military leader Pliny the Elder. The Druids used polished balls of beryl, which is colorless and as clear as glass in its purest form, but can be many different colors depending on its impurities. Scrying or crystal gazing exploded in Europe during the early Middle Ages, when countless wizards, sorcerers, oracles, and seers began using crystal balls to see the future and tell fortunes for classes of all people, both rich and poor, regardless of their religious affiliation. With Christianity spreading throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, many converts and even devout Christians continued to use crystal balls and scrying to gain hidden knowledge in the form of visions, which they consider to be divine messages from heaven. Crystal gazing is a method for seeing visions achieved through trance induction by means of gazing at crystals or stones. The term crystal gazing denotes several different forms of a variety of objects, and there are several different schools of thought as to the sources of the visions seen in the crystal gazing trance. Crystal gazing may be used by practitioners, sometimes called readers or seers, for a variety of purposes, including to predict distant or future events, to give character analysis, to tell fortunes, or to help others make choices about current situations and problems. Scrying is not supported by science as a method of predicting the future or obtaining information unavailable to empirical investigation. The psychologist Mille Kulpin wrote that crystal gazing allows a form of self-hypnosis, with fantasies and memories from the unconscious of the subject appearing as visions inside of the crystal. Analysis of the content suggests that they are a kind of hallucination that visualizes things in memory or of expectations. Healing stones and crystals are touted as ancient forms of medicine used in Buddhism, Hinduism, and other cultures and religions throughout history. People used to include gemstones in magically healing formulas to heal physical, emotional, and spiritual ailments. The Hopi tribe of North America used quartz crystals to assist in diagnosing illnesses, and as mentioned, Pliny the Elder claimed that certain crystals had medicinal properties. Crystal healing is a pseudoscientific alternative medicinal practice that claims stones and crystals contain healing powers. Practitioners of crystal healing believe that they can boost low energy, prevent bad energy, release blocked energy, and transform a body's aura. One method listed for stone cleansing is to place a stone in direct moonlight to recharge its energy. Another standard method of cleansing crystals is by using running water. In the past, the Cherokee tribe kept crystals as their most sacred possession. They believed that the crystals held the energy of their ancestors, and that you could use the crystal in a way to communicate to them during times of need. Some Cherokee homes had huge caches of crystals from many ancestors, kept almost as a library. If someone discovered the crystals and handled them improperly, the connection to their ancestors could be broken and then lost. The conjurers of the tribe wore their crystals on their bodies. The crystals worked for their protection as well as keeping the history and traditions of the tribe. Conjurers or priests were once a noble.
Okay, it took me a second to figure out why he's going into so much depth about these random crystals. So the title of the video is Wisdom of the Stones. I think he's just trying to emphasize that crystals worldwide have been given a pretty high level of significance to different cultures for different reasons, and it just shows that Elden Ring probably has something similar going on, but I feel like this is something that's just kind of a pretty self-evident. So I wonder if he's going to make a stronger point with this overall. Because right now I feel like this stuff, well, it is pretty interesting, especially the bit about the Cherokee there to me. It just feels a little bit fluffy, and I want there to be a little bit more substance to go along with it. Because for a while there, some of the transitions kind of just gave me the vibe of, I don't know how to describe these, but the kind of meme posts where you just keep switching subjects around to make outlandish claims President Martin Van Buren ordered 7,000 federal troops, but vans are a type of vehicle, and vehicles couldn't be used on the Trail of Tears, and then tears are related to the Erd Tree because they drop their crystallized tears, which becomes sap, which turns into amber, and amber is the name of the alert when children go missing. So, not to say that he was doing that egregiously or anything like that. It was just the pacing of it was just kind of funny and reminded me of that at times. So I'm not trying to criticize him here, at least not for that. It's just kind of the vibe that I got for a second. I don't know if you guys felt similarly. I don't know what you call that, where you just make those kind of innocuous connections to build a weird ass conspiracy theory web chain. I don't know. Technically, ice is a type of rock, which should make liquid water a type of lava. Yeah, exactly. Although you probably were not saying that in a conspiracy theory type way. But I mean, it's kind of like that train of thought almost. Okay.
Term the Cherokee used to call both men and women magicians. During the forced removal of the Cherokee, known as the Trail of Tears, many tried to hide or bury their family crystals from the soldiers that were coming in. Sadly, nearly all were found and destroyed. In Elden Ring, the Crystallians appear as crystallized humanoids, living glintstone, found typically in areas obviously associated with crystals, like the Academy Crystal Cave or the Altus Tunnel. They utilize pure crystal weapons that may be made out of the same material as the Crystallians themselves. Glintstone, a material used by mages to produce their sorceries, is a type of crystal stone found to be lodged into the earth of the lands between. The stone is theorized to be a falling cosmic dust or meteorite that crashed into the earth from the sky above. Quick side note, olivine, like glintstone, is a crystal found in the earth's upper mantle, as well as the moon and stony meteorites. The hydration and carbonation of olivine, the most common mineral on earth, produces a large amount of heat. This reaction is too slow for normal technological applications, but when thermally well isolated, it could have many applications for the future of sustainable energy as a super green fuel. This term refers to the fact that this energy production is not associated with CO2 production. Instead, it sequesters CO2 while producing energy. Schools of sorcery found in the Raya Lucaria Academy gain their power.
Yeah, I'll be honest, like that just kind of made my eyes glaze over and I stopped paying attention because I don't know why this is supposed to be significant to Elden Ring right here.
Energy. School.
And like that isn't like a slight against him. I'm just trying to give like my, live feedback here.
Schools of sorcery found in the Raya Lucaria Academy gain their power from the celestial bodies of the night sky. Ancient sorceries are derived from the primeval current, which are labeled a forbidden practice within the Academy. Renala may have classified it as a forbidden practice due to its dangerous nature or because its power is acquired from the stars and not the moon. Grandmasters Lestat and Azur were banished from the Academy for their use of the primeval current, and both have altered themselves to learn the wisdom of the stone.
And yeah, like those types of connections there I'm perfectly fine with, and I'm glad we're getting a bit more grounded again.
Their physical appearance.
Oh no, grounded. Crystals. A pun.
Appearance now reflecting the Crystallians. Petrifaction is defined as turning people into solid stone, and is associated with the legends of Medusa. Medusa had the power to petrify anybody who met her gaze. Similarly, practitioners of the primeval current blindfold themselves to avoid directly viewing it. Witnessing the current was part of the Grand Master's crystallization process. The primeval current has a deep connection to the creation of the universe, a birthplace for...
So actually, that's a pretty good observation, which I didn't make with the Hirdas glintstone crown specifically, but I don't know how applicable it is, and I would want to double check Lusat and Azur's appearances. Yeah, so these glintstone masks are not blindfolded. Is he actually blindfolded? I guess these two kind of are, and they're like more the primeval glintstone folk. So Willem, these dudes. But for what it's worth, Selin doesn't blindfold herself. But I do appreciate the comparison nonetheless, because that might have some thematic ties to either the Thorcerers, Thorn Sorcerers, and the Bloodstar that they saw within Eternal Darkness, or even potentially how Corrin will and the other prophets blindfold themselves to increase their faith in the Erd Tree and whatnot. So that kind of sight beyond sight seems to be a very common thing in the games and related to the kind of guidance that everybody is shown, which kind of seems to be of an elusive private sort, if you will. Petrification? Lies of P reference. Without Horns was disappointed to find out that the Crystallians in the Moon Plateau respawn, what with them not being able to replenish their numbers and lore. So, respawning is kind of different than, than reproducing, but sure, I get what you're saying there. Salizu says, for some reason wisdom of the stone makes you think the Crystallians think incredibly slowly. That's actually pretty much canon from what I can recall, because the wisdom of the stone is described as having like a faint cogitation, which would kind of go along with that. Let me look it up. Oops. Sorry for bumping the mic. Let me make it a little bit bigger for you guys. So in Crystal Barrage, it says it's a sorcery of the Crystal Cadre, a group of sorcerers who pursue the wisdom of stone, the secrets locked in the faint cogitation of the Crystallians. So I think the Japanese is similar. Kinda, yeah. So the way I kind of always understood like the Crystallians is that they kind of seem to be more brainstem functioning rather than like higher order thoughts, which is kind of surprising and almost seems like a bit contradictory with the way that the other glintstone sorcerers are like devoting themselves to like increasing their intelligence stat to be able to study this stuff, when in actuality the Crystallians are just kind of like incredibly slow. But to be fair, I think the whole idea of slowness is kind of isn't like slow as in I'm still here. I'm just trying to think of how to articulate it. Like, because I'm just like running into the wall of like slow is slow, but slow is not slow. How do you describe slow without saying slow? Okay. Unintelligent. So I don't think the slowness here is meant to be understood as unintelligent. I think it's just kind of slow as an alien because these things are inorganic creatures and the constraints of time don't have as much sway over them because like they aren't constrained by biology the same way that humans or like tarnished are, if that makes any sense there. But yeah, like slow here kind of means it more in the sense of like dull. Damn it, no, dull is not the right word. Faint. Wait, is that what they use in the official localization? In the faint cogitation. So yeah, no, like the localization is fine by calling it the faint cogitation of the Crystallians. But that doesn't necessarily mean slow as an unintelligent, but it kind of does. Anyway, I'm just kind of like getting too distracted by that. Without Horn says, clear thoughts, just ones that take a while to formulate. Yeah, I think so. Like, it's just very faint, so really hard to detect. Probably because they're slow. Like, literally slow. Yeah, and as Chadwick said, our lives are short and fast compared to rocks. If a rock thinks, it may be slowly indeed. And I think that's a pretty common trope for, like, satirical takes on high fiction. I think that's kind of like a device that Terry Pratchett would use very often, where, like, the trolls are just extremely slow and dumb and literally have rocks for brains. Like an Ent. Yeah, Ents are faster than rocks, but yeah, that's kind of like the right track to go on. Scalzi would almost say that Lusat and Azur are turning into Crystallians, but they look so different even from each other. So yeah, and if you think about it, when Azur, the green one, hands you his magic spell, even his hand opens extremely slowly, and their minds kind of like get scattered in a way. Like it just kind of gets dissipated and swallowed within the grandness of the primeval current.
Associated with the legends of Medusa. Medusa had the power to petrify anybody who met her gaze. Similarly, practitioners of the primeval current blindfold themselves to avoid directly viewing it. Witnessing the current was part of the Grand Master's crystallization process. The primeval current has a deep connection to the creation of the universe, a birthplace for stars, and possibly a black hole. The practice of the current results in graven mass schools of mages that have been transformed into stone spheres, called seeds of stars. Crystallians taught sorcery to those at the Academy, a group known as the Crystal Cadre, as well as the Carian royal family about the powers of the Glintstone. Many powerful sorceries and incantations within the lands between are taught by outer gods, or beings from the void of space. The Crystal Sword mentions a theory that the Crystallians yearn for the return of their creator, who will carve for them new brethren. It also mentions that they safeguard their crystals until the end. Is their creator the primeval current? Check out how the Comet Azure, a primeval spell, matches the Crystal Torrent, a Crystallian sorcery. Sorceress Selene explains that Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while Glintstone contains residual life. Selene also fuses her essence into the primal Glintstone, showing that Glintstone can contain an individual's essence, or soul. In this way, Crystallians may reflect the Cherokee tribe in the belief.
And some of this stuff gets really complicated to me because technically Selene does not inhabit the body of her new puppet until you kill her old body, which is really fascinating to me because, like, if her soul is imbued in her blade, why can't you just transfer it directly into the new puppet? And the answer literally seems to be that the original body needs to die for the transfer to be complete. And so there's kind of like this really weird mind-body split in Elden Ring that is underexplored. Not necessarily by like lore creators, but just by like the lore itself. So just to read the Primal Glintstone Blade description here, since it's readily available, the old sorcerers would slice open their hearts with these blades to imbue a primal glintstone with their soul, and thus did they die. So it seems like killing one's original body is one of the necessary components in being able to transfer their souls and bodies, or minds and whatnot.
In this way, Crystallians may reflect the Cherokee tribe in the belief that crystals contain their ancestors, or a connection to past lives, which may just be the wisdom of the stone. Selene believes to be a child of the stars. The Crystallians also appear to be tied to Glintstone, and therefore could be theorized as the ancestors of the astrologers. Crystal release is yet another direct connection to the cosmos. It mentions crystal rain, which is a real occurrence, as shown by the NASA's Spitzer Space Telescope, which detected tiny green crystals raining down on a developing star. The sorcery description also mentions the crystal sun, which is the transformation of a star or sun into a crystallized sphere. White dwarfs are hot, dense remnants of long-dead stars, and they undergo a process where their inner cores crystallize over time. Billions of years from now, our own sun will die, and it is theorized that the sun will likely turn into a giant space crystal about the size of our Earth that will mark the spot where our solar system once was. Crystallians are often found sitting lotus style in deep meditation. Lotus is a cross-legged sitting meditation pose from ancient India. It is also an ancient asana in yoga and is widely used for meditation in Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Ekaggata is a Pali-Buddhist term meaning tranquility of mind, one-pointedness, or unification of mind. An old saying goes, "He who is concentrated knows and sees according to the truth." One-pointedness temporarily inhibits sensual desire, a necessary condition for any meditative attainment. Interestingly, the process of crystallization with the Glintstone Firefly also results in an inability to beguile potential mates.
So if I remember correctly, this is not exactly in the Japanese, and I wish it was. Let me double check. So yeah. The bit about beguiling potential mates specifically is not in Japanese here, but I should just pull it up for you guys. Hold on. So yeah, it says like once it's like becomes like through crystallization, it's loses its power of magical attraction essentially. It doesn't say anything about potential mates, because even though I think that could still be a fair reading of things, by not having it be explicit, it really throws a wrench in some of my plans where gold and silver are kind of necessary components into formulating new life. And once you reproduce, you kind of like potentially lose a part of yourself. And that's why these things like might crystallize, because they've like given their fate to their offspring so that they can live life anew once like the parent like passes on and whatnot. That will allow the second generation to continue and thrive and grow. And that might tie into something that like Gowrie says, where he thinks like the best thing that the older generation can do for the younger generation is to be forgotten. And it might not make a lot of sense for me to just like spout this stuff in a vacuum here, but there's a lot of weird interplays between the soul, life, and memory in Elden Ring that are kind of hard to touch upon without a lot of context to set that up beforehand. So if you guys have more questions about that, I'll try to answer it. Wait, how can I even drag it that far down? Anyway. Hey, Two Hit, how's it going? Firefly, watch out for Whedonisms. Oh no. Oh yeah, and so one of the other things about the Fireflies in the 1.0 version of the game, they kind of got brought up in a similar yet different context with the Baldachin's Blessing. And I'm kind of disappointed it got removed. So, and the thing is, like, the Japanese text didn't, like, it was pretty much updated before the game went gold. So this is like the same as the current version of the game. So I don't know if this description got updated or whatnot. Anyway, the localization at this time of the game said, the seductive light of the firefly allows the viewer to forget bodily aches and pains, if only for a while. Death is only peace, pain is but a promise. I feel like that part might be a Frog Nationism, but anyway, equating Firefly to the light that is seen from the Baldachin's Blessing is relevant because a baldachin is a type of curtain that is draped over a bed. So that imagery alone should be enough to kind of like imply like sex and reproduction and stuff like that. But it isn't retained in like the kind of final version of the game. Chadwick says, those flies not reproduce, they're consigned to their own crystal, their knowledge ends with them. Oh, saying that they get consigned to their own crystal is a kind of a interesting thing to say, but while I don't necessarily think that these things will continue to produce, one part of that is that it's not actually explicit, because there might be other ways to reproduce with glintstone, and that might just be like requiring somebody else to like fill the vessel and whatnot. So like I said earlier, while I think you can still kind of come to this conclusion, it's a little bit unfortunate that it's not quite this direct in the Japanese here.
Similar to how the one-pointedness inhibits sensual desire. In closing, the Crystallians are living glintstone that may have been created by the primeval current. They reside close to areas that contain glintstone, possibly to protect the stone itself.
Oh yeah, and I guess I should probably add or recontextualize that. Part of the reason why I think this is important is if glintstone fireflies lost their power of attraction, that would imply that a glintstone firefly is originally a gold firefly or a silver firefly, and it isn't clear which is which. And so if it's gold firefly, I think it's very fascinating that gold can turn into glintstone, but you know, that we're not given that confirmation. And likewise, if it's a silver firefly, it's interesting that silver could become glintstone. And so maybe both can become glintstone, and this is just kind of like the in-between state of both of those, where it's kind of like in the twilight of its years. Crystallian Dirty Talk being like, fill the vessel for me. You forgot to add a bunch of spaces between your letters there without horns.
In closing, the Crystallians are living glintstone that may have been created by the primeval current. They reside close to areas that contain glintstone, possibly to protect the stone itself. Glintstone may hold the souls of past lives, as the primal glintstone blade was used in the past by old sorcerers to slice open their own hearts to imbue a primal glintstone with their soul. The idea of transferring your soul from an organic...
Or maybe like another way to read the glintstone fireflies is that they were all originally glintstone. The golden and silver fireflies were originally glintstone, but once they reproduced, they kind of lost their proverbial magic and then kind of reverted back into an emptier state. Scowlezy asks, are crystallians made from glintstone or just regular crystal? Unfortunately, we don't know if there's really a difference between glintstone or regular crystals in the game, do we? But that's a good question, though.
Organic form to an inorganic form may be the sorcerer's way to achieve immortality through the wisdom of the stone. Thank you so much for your time today, and as always, I hope you have a wonderful week. Hydromancy is a method.
So that was a pretty quick ending there. So we're going to go back to the last video and like and share it with you guys. If you are so inclined to do the same, feel free to do that from this link. But okay, everybody, that'll pretty much be it for tonight's stream because I took too long reacting to the other videos, which is, fine. It's not like I was going to do anything different on stream. But anyway, thank you so much for joining. We'll be going live again, doing pretty much the same thing tomorrow or today, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as usual. So, till the next stream, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out. Hey, Crystal, sorry that you missed it. At least the VODs are available.